Chapter 151, Anko Rin, the one where you have the same heartbeat. They were just good friends. Anko repeated this to herself for the 100th time as she watched Rin stretch indolently, limbs sprawled on the grass and twisted amongst the other bodies around them. After a contingent of rogue shinobi from Suna attacked the village that morning, bent on revenge for some grievance they suffered during the war, several of the Konoha youngsters had decided the best way to relax would be to collapse in a messy heap on whatever large patch of grass they came to first. With so many bodies intertwined and woven together, Anko thought they looked rather like a piece of cloth with threads made out of people instead of wool. Rin lay next to her, the only person with a little space left available where she could rest her head and not have her temple grinding up against Ibuki's ankle or nestled in Denma's crotch. They were just good friends. It shouldn't have been so hard to just lay her head down and close her eyes for some well-earned rest. Yet here she was, the only person still sitting upright, her heart beating wildly in such a way that she knew was from herself and not her soulmate, wherever they were. Who needed soulmates when Rin was the most kind and gentle creature that she had ever met? It wasn't like her friend shared her interest, though. Anko had resigned herself to pining from afar the moment she realized she had developed feelings for the other girl. Rin was waiting for her own soulmate to find her, and Anko respected that decision even if she didn't feel the need to do the same. That didn't mean it was any easier to deal with these feelings of longing, but at least she wasn't resentful like Obito acted sometimes. Steeling her nerves, Anko told herself that if she was going to accept they were just friends, then she was going to have to act like it. And she might as well take her jollies where she found them. Rin cracked an eye open and gestured for her to lay down, so she took that as her cue to cuddle right up to her best friend and close her eyes, head on Rin's chest like it was no big deal. Really, she was screaming inside, but it was a good kind of screaming. The sort of excitable screaming she would never let anyone actually catch her doing for fear of ruining her own reputation as a badass kunoichi. As exhausted as she was as they all were, she fell asleep fairly quickly, letting the rapid thrum of Rin's heartbeat lull her to sleep without once questioning why it was beating so fast. She awakened more than an hour later to see that Rado and Genma had both somehow wriggled out of the pile and disappeared. Asuma had a deft grip on Kurenai's waist, still deeply asleep, but Ibuki was in the process of extracting himself with the use of a body flicker. He settled himself down against a nearby tree and closed his eyes, falling back to sleep almost immediately. Anko gave some serious consideration to rolling away now that she had the room to do so, but she was comfortable enough where she was to hopefully fall back to sleep herself, and she was very prepared to offer the excuse that she had slept the whole way through without waking. Only, this time, her dreams seemed too far away. Apparently that 1 hour of rest was all her body had needed. Her nose wrinkled with displeasure as she tried to fight her way back to unconsciousness, counting time with Rin's now steady heartbeat in an attempt to trick her own mind with the soothing rhythm. Anko frowned and opened her eyes again, her instincts telling her something was off, but her foggy brain unsure of what that something was. No one else was moving around them. Her ears were picking up no unusual sounds other than the distant sounds of village life and the thumping heart beneath her ear. The heart. Rin's heartbeat. It matched her own rhythm perfectly. As soon as she noticed, she felt her own heart rate pick up, and she could hear Rin's increasing as well, keeping perfect time. It could only mean one thing. The one thing that she had desperately dreamed of and yet not even dared to let herself imagine because she'd assumed it would never come true. Rin was her soulmate. Of course, the first thing Anko did was jolt upright with every intention of shouting out her discovery and positively crowing with triumphant joy. Without doubt, this was the best day of her life. Everyone in Konoha and beyond should know how happy she was. The words died in her throat when she looked down and saw the way Rin was still peacefully slumbering, her sweet face made impossibly sweeter with a languid smile as she dragged the afternoon away. Anko found she didn't have it in her to disturb the other girl. It wasn't like the connection she had discovered was going anywhere. She could tell the world about them later. Smiling and weightless with joy, she knew she would never get back to sleep now, but that didn't stop Anko from laying down, gently resting her head on Rin's chest again. Any good shinobi could be patient when they needed to, and Rin was certainly more than worth waiting for. Chapter 152, Madara Tobirama, the one where you can't smile until you meet. Madara scowled as he kicked at the rocks along the riverbank. He wasn't actually upset in any way, but if he couldn't smile then he might as well frown. Such a happy feeling in his chest demanded that he make at least some sort of expression. Frowning was the best he could manage right now. He was actually sort of grateful for his dour expression when the person he'd been waiting for finally dropped down on the opposite bank. It simply wouldn't do for someone as goofy as Hashirama to know that Madara was happy to see him. That would just be embarrassing. No, better to continue frowning so his new friend didn't get any funny ideas about him caring or anything. As he usually did, Hashirama greeted Madara with a beaming smile. He'd been lucky enough to meet his soulmate already when his clan Senju or otherwise, but Madara had his suspicions had been visited by distant relatives from some other clan far to the east this summer. Apparently her name was Mido and she was the most beautiful person in the whole world. Madara was willing to bet that Hashirama was wrong about that. He hadn't met his own soulmate yet, but he was absolutely sure they were going to be more beautiful than this Mido lady could ever hope to be. Madara, guess what? Hashirama chirped as he hurried across the lazy river. You finally learned how to tie your own shoes. Madara drawled. Then he sighed when Hashirama paused to tilt his head in confusion. I wear sandals. Kami, you're dumb. Frowning harder, he prompted, I'm not guessing, so just tell me. Hashirama was nearly dancing in his enthusiasm with the way he flapped his arms about. I convinced my baby brother that peace between all the ninja clans was a good idea, and he says he wants to meet you because of okay, well, this part is kind of main, but he says neither of us is probably smart enough to think of the really important details if we really do build a village together someday and... Breath, Anija. Madara's gaze snapped back across the river to see another young boy there, a scrawny-looking thing with paper-white skin, dark red eyes, and hair like a tuft of white goose down on top of his head. He didn't seem to notice that his pants were far too big, probably hamadowns from an older relative, but he moved like he was much too aware of his growing limbs. He would have been entirely unimpressive looking if not for the sharpness of his features, a promise made now in youth that he would likely fill out later in adulthood. Madara lifted one brow. That's your brother, he said. The boy looked over at him, his expression equally bland. And I suppose that makes you Madara. The pleasure is all yours, I'm sure. Hashirama, throw this brother out and get a new one. I don't like this one. Madara bit his tongue to stop himself from laughing when they both gave him matching looks of offense. They were definitely related despite the disparity in their appearances. The second Hashirama launched into a speech about playing nice and getting along. Madara tuned him out. Whether or not his friend noticed he was being ignored was not Madara's problem. Already he was focused on looking closer at the newcomer, sizing him up as a possible threat and wondering if he really did think himself smart enough to come up with ideas for a village that neither of his elders had thought of. 15 minutes and a few tentative questions later, and he had his answer. This kid was smart. Not just smart, he was a veritable genius. Madara hadn't even realized how many gaping holes there were in their loose plans for double-wide streets and houses with gardens where no child would ever have to die before their time. Tobirama, as he introduced himself, proposed all sorts of things like administration centers, security outposts, irrigation systems, taxes, and even codified laws. Madara had never heard of any shinobi clan that bothered to write down their laws and customs. That sort of stuff had always been passed down through word of mouth. Strangely, Tobirama appeared delighted that Madara was getting excited over something as silly as a codified system of law for their imaginary village. The boy didn't even seem to realize that he was grinning widely until Hashirama rose back out of his sulk to gasp and point rudely with one finger. Oh. Tobi. You're smiling. I am. Tobirama paused to reach up and feel at the muscles in his face, eyes blowing up wide when he realized he was indeed smiling for the first time in his life. But that's impossible. I would have had to meet my due. Now it was him pointing fingers in an unintentional mirror of his older brother. Madara stared down at the hand almost shoved into his chest, nervously licking his lips as he tried to process the accusation. Slowly, tentatively, he made an attempt to imitate the happy expression he'd seen tons of adults make at each other, the one that Hashirama sometimes seemed to have permanently glued to his own face. It felt weird to tilt the corners of his mouth up instead of down, but it worked when it never had before. He was doing it. Madara was smiling. And both of the Senju brothers were staring. What, he demanded. What are you guys looking at? Hashirama seemed at a loss for words, but when his sibling finally responded, he didn't do much better either. Beautiful was all Tobirama managed to say, and it didn't even look like he realized he had said it. Madara flushed with pleasure and straightened his shoulders a little, trying the expression again with more honest feeling this time. He was pleased to see the effect it had on his new soulmate. Tobirama looked utterly stunned by the sight of him. This, he thought to himself as he prayed, could definitely work. Chapter 153, Madara, Tobirama, the one where you write their thoughts while you're distracted. Madara was young and small and bored, trapped in his first calligraphy class when he could have been outside learning more Kada, in dripping carelessly from his brush to ruin the page beneath him. He was dozing off in the summer heat as he idly touched the tip of his brush to the page to draw pointless circles when suddenly there weren't circles anymore but fully formed kanji spilling across the parchment in elegant swoops. He only noticed when the tiny little woman who was trying to teach him his calligraphy gasped and snatched the paper away from him with a mockingly proud cur. "Oh ho ho, do we have a little genius on our hands?" Susumu-sensei asked. Madara blinked. "Huh? No. Are those words? I don't know what they say." She gasped all over again and carefully returned the page. "Ah, my lucky little pastry. That means you've made a connection with your soulmate. Should I tell you what it says?" "What?" "No. No, I want to read it myself." I see. Well, let's get learning then. Perhaps if you are very lucky, someday you might reach a state when you are both in tune with each other enough to have a direct conversation. He paid much more attention after that. It took months to learn his letters well enough for him to puzzle his way through the absent thought he had captured on paper, but when he did it was worth it. Madara laid in bed with the precious scroll clutched to his chest and muffled his laughter behind the other palm. Anita couldn't look any stupider if I braided his hair and sewed his hands to his ears. Whoever his soulmate was, they already had a small corner of his heart. Over the years it happened every so often, on the rare occasion his attention drifted when he happened to be holding a brush or a pencil. Each time it occurred, Madara made sure to keep the precious scrap of parchment, hoarding them away in a box under his floor, and he only ever read them while he was alone. The private thoughts of his soulmate were for his eyes only. Sometimes they were idle thoughts about the stupidity of the people around them, and Madara would laugh as he looked forward to hearing that cess firsthand. Other times they might be considering thoughts on battle tactics or weapon choices. Madara nodded along with the sense in those ones and was glad to know that his soulmate was a fellow shinobi. He was sure he would never have anything in common with a fragile civilian, let alone be able to share his life with one. But his favorite thoughts were the ones that had nothing to do with anything important, whimsical ideas about impossible dreams that were sometimes happy and sometimes sad. Those, Madara felt, told him more than anything about what sort of person his soulmate was. He wished he could say that the most important events of his life were all accompanied by little notes of his soulmate's thoughts, but unfortunately that just wasn't to be. His personality was such that he simply couldn't let his thoughts wander when something important was happening around him, not when he might miss some crucial detail. When he agreed to a ceasefire with the Senja, while he sat through all the boring yet necessary peace talks as they built the village he had always dreamed about, through all of that he had no time to let his mind drift and connect him with his other half. Not until all was said and done and both of their clients had settled in, with several others having agreed to join them. The day he finally had a chance to sit and breathe, he was hunched behind a massive pile of paperwork and staring down at the report in front of him with no will to read through it. His fingers lifted a pencil to twirl it around and round, tapping the graphite tip on the pages in front of him while his mind wandered away to the cafe across the street. Should he go out for lunch today? Any ideas about lunch were abandoned when he felt his fingers pause, not having noticed they were moving in the first place. With an oddly detached feeling he looked down to see that he had written something across the top of the report. "If my brother does not smarten up, I am going to kill him." Quiet chuckles escaped him as he thought idly that he could apply that same sentiment to his own brother. "We could team up and throttle them together" wrote itself across his page, and Madara paused. That sounded a great deal like it was in response to him. How curious. Curious indeed. It's nice to finally speak with him. Madara very nearly dropped his pencil, hanging onto it only because the muscles in his fingers clenched in shock. He had always wanted to meet his soulmate, and now here they were somehow talking to each other. I've always wanted to meet him too. If only he were in Konoha. But he was in Konoha. Madara swallowed thickly and thought about how he had built the damn place. Of course he was here. His pencil skidded across the page yet again, and when he looked down he felt the strangest rush of joy and fear all at once. Holy shit, my soulmate is Madara. Was that a good reaction? A bad one? The written words were devoid of any emotional context, only stared back at him with no further answer even though he waited for several minutes. He was left with nothing to do but sit at his desk and scream internally over how many unanswered questions he suddenly had. The idea that he might have walked right past his soulmate on the street was frustrating. They could have been together ages ago. The rest of his day passed slowly, filled with large periods of time in which he simply could not focus on anything. He'd spoken directly with his soulmate for the first time since Susumu-sensei explained that it was possible all those years ago. They knew who he was. So why had they not come to him so that they could speak in person? It would have been the first action he took if he were the one to suss out their identity, too excited to finally have an answer to stay away for long. That they failed to appear by the time he wandered home from the office led him to suspect that they were not exactly thrilled to be his match. Madara sat down to a simple dinner that night, overcooked in his distraction although he was still too out of it to notice anyway, and picked at it slowly while he tried to come to terms with the fact that he had done something to estrange his own soulmate before he'd even met them. He wished he could say it was a surprise, but he'd always known he had a caustic personality. He'd just always assumed his soulmate would love him the way he was. To be proved wrong was a disappointment, to say the least. Soft knocking at the front door brought him up out of his stupor enough to frown and wonder what the hell Tobirama, of all people, could need from him at this hour. Even his fellow workaholic should be home at least pretending to take a rest from all they did during the day, but that could be only his chakra signature hovering on the porch, and Madara knew very well he wouldn't be going away until he had whatever he'd come for. With a reluctant grumble he pulled himself away from the burnt rice in his bowl and marched over to wrench his front door open, one eyebrow already lifted in question. It was joined by the other in surprise when he saw the hesitant, almost shy way that Tobirama stood before him, weight shuffling back and forth like a nervous child. He didn't speak before shoving something under Madara's nose and seeming to fold back into himself. At first Madara didn't understand what the big deal was. It was only a speech Tobirama had been working on to present to the first academy teachers when they were chosen. Flipping through it, however, revealed that on the fourth page down near the bottom it seemed the man had gotten distracted and begun doodling in the margins. Interesting. He wouldn't have thought Tobirama was the type. When the doodling turned into words and he recognized the lines of thought laid out on the page, he froze. Those were his thoughts. Those were the things he had been thinking about when he and his soulmate had tuned into each other at the same time. Madara's had snapped up to find Tobirama watched him shyly through the fringe of his hair. Everything about the man's body language was cautious but open, watchful, clearly prepared for a negative reaction but just as clearly hoping for a positive one. At least he understood the words from earlier now. Holy shit was all he could think to say. Tobirama nodded sagely. Yes, that was my first thought too. I apologize for leaving you in the dark for so long. As ashamed as I am to admit it, I needed time to get used to the idea. Build up the courage to say something, Tobirama corrected him, eyes dropping to the side with shame. Madara nodded and took a slow, deep breath in. Then he let it back out just as slowly while he weighed his options. It was a quick decision. He'd just spent several hours thinking his soulmate didn't want him, and the thought of not even trying now gave him the same empty feeling in his chest that he'd been fighting against up until 3 minutes ago. Would you like to come in? He offered. I can recook dinner. Oh. Yes. That sounds yes. Madara smirked faintly. He'd never heard Tobirama like that stutter in his life. The man had shown more human emotion in his brief time here on the front step than he had in all the years they'd known each other so far. As he closed the door behind him, Madara realized he was smiling, feeling oddly hopeful for his future all of a sudden. It was a strange feeling, but he was certain he could grow to enjoy it. Chapter 154, Madara. Tobirama, the one where you can't lie. I don't like you, were the first words he ever spoke directly to the other man, and he very much meant them at the time. Tobirama had only snorted and looked away with arms folded, grumbling something inaudible under his breath. An alliance had sounded like a great idea until they realized they would have to avoid killing each other from now on. Most of their first interactions were in a formal setting, across the table from each other and glaring hard as their elders bickered over the exact phrasing of some random and consequential passage of the peace treaty between their clients. When they spoke, they kept their words short and to the point, deliberately avoiding insulting each other, with Hashirama right next to them prepared to lecture about the benefits of playing nice. The only words that passed their lips were opinions on certain demands and explanations for things when required. During the construction of the village, they didn't really speak to each other much at all, preferring to pass their communication back and forth using Hashirama or a very tired-looking Hikako as a middleman. When they were forced to speak face-to-face, they frequently dissolved into petty insults that they meant with all their hearts. At that point in his life, Madara truly believed Tobirama had an irritating face. Every time he saw the man, his blood pressure skyrocketed. Tobirama was able to tell him that he had his head up his own ass with no trouble because it was a well-used turn of phrase in the forces that he knew well enough that he didn't mean it literally. Once life settled down into the humdrum of everyday paperwork and regular missions, they did interact more often but still tried to keep their words to a minimum. It wasn't that they didn't fight, they did that with a frequency which thoroughly exhausted the rest of the administration staff, but rather that they did everything in their power to avoid being forced into the same room together. Hashirama's presence coded the worst of the insults and accusations they might have made, things they grumbled to themselves when they were alone and frustrated. But the worst was hardly all. Tobirama told Madara when he was asking too much, and Madara told Tobirama when he was giving too little. Both believed themselves to be right, with not a thought given to Hashirama's whining suggestions of compromise. A year passed with numerous council meetings ending in shouts, but all of them survived to see their new Hokage's face carved into the side of the mountain that protected the northern border of the village. Finally, Madara and Tobirama found something they could honestly agree on with no fights. They both despised that stupid monument. Tobirama muttered about having to close his curtains so he wouldn't see his older brother staring in the window at all times. Madara grumbled that it didn't even look like Hashirama all that much. Both of them hated that they agreed with the other, but neither of them wasted the effort of denying it. It wasn't long after such a regrettable carving was unleashed upon the world that Hashirama got an idea into his head. A very stupid idea. Madara and Tobirama were both very honest when they told him it was a bad idea, but they were not speaking to each other when they cited their reasons. No force on earth existed that could stop them from telling their Hokage little fibs like, "We'll never have anything in common, and I hate him," to the barn. It didn't matter anyway. He sent them both to the Suna border with a stern finger and instructions for them to just work together for a few days as an example of the unity between their clients. "You stink," Tobirama told him after 4 days on the road with no chance to stop for a bath. "Well, your hair looks stupid," Madara drawled in return, snickering at the way it was sticking up on one side but lying flat on the other. "The next river we come to we are stopping, and I will throw you into it if I have to." His footsteps didn't pause, but Tobirama frowned. That wasn't quite how he'd meant to word his sentence. He'd meant to word that threat as a certainty that he would be playing toss the Uchiha regardless of cooperation or not. Madara didn't notice anything amiss, however, so he snapped his mouth shut and kept walking. Since the next river they managed to stumble across was another half-day away, with heat from the nearby Suna desert rolling over them in waves, both of them were more than ready to dunk themselves as soon as they arrived, weapons and all. Luckily for the steel they were carrying, they managed to resist. Tobirama set up a perimeter around the area while Madara disarmed the traps set up around the oasis. This close to the desert, any water was precious and borders were always vague when there was no one around to enforce them. Madara was the first to start stripping. "You don't think maybe you should take this opportunity to wash your clothes at the same time?" Tobirama hoped that with his body turned in the opposite direction his companion might not see how red his face was. With any luck his ears would not betray him. "It'll be easier to wash them if I can scrub them out, and it's sort of hard to do that when I'm already wearing them," Madara pointed out. "Why? You not a prude, are you?" "No," Tobirama answered honestly. Then he clamped his teeth down on the rest of the words that wanted to slip out. "Wearing Kami's name was his self-control today. Good, because you need to wash yourself, and I am more than willing to scrub your I mean. No. That isn't what I was going to say. I meant that I would kill for a chance to touch your no, not that either." Tobirama spun around to stare at Madara, who had apparently already removed his upper robe and was standing knee-deep in nothing but his trousers, loose from their usual wrappers but snug around the hips in all the right ways. He was also wearing a blush from the crown of his head to about mid-chest, a fetching shade of pink that gave him a strangely innocent look for a man who had taken so many lives. Despite his intention to deny any thoughts he had in a similar vein, when Tobirama opened his mouth, what came out was completely different. "I've been thinking about that for the last 2 days." "You what? What would it take for you to pretend you did not just hear me say that?" Unlike his companion, Tobirama was above the whole flailing and screaming act when he was met with such an unexpected occurrence as his own brain taking an unauthorized vacation. "It was a close call there. I mean, you could try coming into the water with me and actually letting me scrub your back." Madara bit his lip and clapped both hands over his mouth, muffling his next words. "I wasn't trying to. Why can't I say what I want to say? What sort of jutsu is this? What have you done, Senju?" "Me? I didn't do anything. Get out of my head." "I'm not in your head." They glared at each other and Madara huffed. "I bet you'd love to get in my head." "Yes, I would." Tobirama winced at his own honesty. "Maybe then I could figure out what makes you tick." He could see Madara taking in a deep breath, no doubt working himself up for a rant or a comeback of some sort, but the words washed right over them as they burst forth with the usual volume. It felt like his soul had ever so gently detached itself from him as he stood utterly still and stared as though he was seeing the man in front of him for the first time. After several minutes, his companion finally noticed that he wasn't responding. Unsurprisingly, he did not take too well to being ignored when he was throwing out some of his snappiest insults, all true in their own way. "What is your problem?" Madara demanded. "I think we are soulmates." Madara's foot slipped in his shock, his entire body disappearing under the water with a splash and an indignant squawk. When he resurfaced, there was a comment on the tip of Tobirama's tongue about how much he looked like a drowned rat, but instead all he did was blurt out what was really on his mind. "I sort of like the idea." He resisted the urge to hide, cursing his easy blush as Madara clawed what hair out of his face to stare incredulously. "Well, fine. Me too." They were both equally surprised by his agreement. All right. Well. What now?" Madara took a deep breath in, paused, and then mumbled tentatively, "You could let me scrub your back." If anyone else asked, Tobirama would tell them he only agreed because they both really did smell bad after so long without bathing and he didn't mind the help. It was certainly not because he wanted to stand a little closer to Madara while the man was dripping wet from head to toe and not wearing a shirt. Ridiculous. Clearly that wasn't even a relevant factor. Of course, if Madara asked, he would have said something entirely different. One cannot lie to one's soulmate, after all. Chapter 155, Sakumo Tobirama, the one with identical accessories. Being dead was a strange experience. Sakumo thought he was rather more qualified than most to say that since he had spent just over 2 decades hovering in limbo, unable to die yet entirely cut off from his living body. Only after he'd had a chance to speak with his son had he been able to move on and reach the long-awaited afterlife. And it was weird. Sakumo wasn't certain what he had been expecting out of being dead, but a full reflection of Earth with houses and streets and meals, wasn't it? Not that he was in any way disappointed, only confused. He didn't need to eat, had tested it and gone 3 full weeks without so much as a hunger pain, but the act of eating 3 times a day brought a sense of normalcy that made his rest so much easier. Nor did he need to sleep, yet still most people enjoyed laying their head down when the ever-golden sun in the sky chose to set for a few hours. What he found the most odd, however, was the mingling of generations. As soon as he had arrived in the afterlife, he'd been greeted by both his mother and a woman who looked younger than himself but was apparently his great-great-great-aunt. 2 weeks after he had arrived, he was surprised to stumble across the now very old third Hokage, and then the day after that he was sitting with the sister he had lost as a child, trailing his feet in a pond while she chatted on to him with the speech patterns of an innocent but the vocabulary of an ancient. He had been dead several months when he was honored to come face to face with the first Hokage himself, Senju Hashirama. "Shodaime-sama," he gasped. Then he immediately stood aside and bowed, expecting the god of shinobi to pay no mind to someone like him and carry on with whatever he had chosen to do with his honorable afterlife. He certainly did not expect a booming friendly laugh or a hand to clap down on the fur he wore around his shoulders. "Haven't been called that in a while," the first Hokage said. "And to whom do I have the pleasure of speaking?" "Oh. Hatik Sakumo, Your Honor." "No need for that, no need for that. We are all equal in death, are we not?" Sakumo tilted his head to one side and gave no answer. His own death had been far from a good one. Kakashi's forgiveness may have given him the peace he needed to move on, but he still had a long way to go before he would ever grant himself anything close to that same forgiveness. Taking his own life had seemed like the only proper option left at the time. It hadn't taken long afterwards for him to realize that it had been nothing but the coward's way out. "You know, this fur of yours looks awfully familiar." Hashirama leaned closer to inspect the pelt he wore around his neck, and Sakumo froze, hardly daring to breathe. "Oh, I had it all my life, but I am sorry to say that we likely never met. You passed while I was still just a pup. Perhaps you knew someone who wore something similar." "Right. Yes." The next thing he knew, he was being pulled down the bustling street like a child on the arm of the man he respected second most in the entire world. After turning several corners, he was brought face to face with the man he respected the absolute most. Senju Tobirama was even more impressive in person than he had been in the grainy photographs taken for the history books, more impressive than even the officially commissioned paintings that always tended to exaggerate their subjects for the generations to come. It was hard to tell whether or not he minded having his eternal afternoon interrupted just to have some unworthy stranger shoved in his face. "Brother, look, he's wearing your fur." Hashirama clapped like an excitable child. Sakumo wasn't sure if he wanted to stare at that unexpected reaction or at the chiseled face staring down at him. Being tall himself, it was always vaguely startling to meet someone who stood taller. Both of the faint Senju siblings towered over him like trees, and they were both built like trees too. "So he is," Tobirama rumbled, sharp red eyes dragging up and down Sakumo's form. "My apologies for disturbing you," he said in as respectful a tone as he could muster. "I did not mean fur." "Exactly the same fur, in fact." Sakumo blinked when the other man cut him off. Then he dropped his eyes to look at the collar wrapped around the Nadane's shoulders. It was indeed an exact replica of the pelt he himself had always worn, though his was the item which had been meant to match him to his soulmate. His eyes widened, face going slack with shock. Tobirama stepped closer to raise one hand and graze his palm along the soft strands with a faint, barely there smile. It was a startling expression from such a stern face, one that transformed him entirely from handsome to drop-dead gorgeous. Sakumo would have been ashamed of how weak his knees were if not for the fact that his thoughts were utterly empty. With the man he had always secretly idolized standing so close, he was rendered speechless, even more so because of the discovery they had just made. Who would have thought that one could find one's soulmate even after death? "You wouldn't mind, would you?" Tobirama asked him, gesturing to the silver clasp that held his collar in place. Sakumo hurried to undo it. "No, no, of course not." "By all means." It was off his shoulders a moment later and held out with a bashful smile. For a man who had married and conceived a child when he was still alive, he was acting oddly shy now that he had finally found the one he was truly meant to be with. Hopefully he would come to his senses soon so that he could have a chance to convince Tobirama that he wasn't entirely a bumbling buffoon. Or, at least, not all the time. His breath stuttered in his chest as he watched Tobirama replace his own fur collar with the one that Sakumo had been wearing, offering the other in return. "Mayor." Sure." He cleared his throat and nodded once decisively. "I mean, yes. Please." "Clearly you already know who I am," Tobirama said as he settled his own fur around Sakumo's shoulders and clasped it into place. "I should like to know your name as well." When Hashirama piped up beside them, Sakumo very nearly leapt out of his own skin. He had entirely forgotten the first Hokage was even there, too wrapped up in the moment between him and his newly discovered soulmate. "Oh, I know that one. His name is Hatik Sakumo." "Yes." "Fakey brother." That was clearly a question I meant for you to answer. Tobirama's voice was dripping with sarcasm, but it was the single eyebrow lifted in judgment that had Hashirama cowering away and raising both hands defensively, his smile fading away into nervous laughter. "I'll just let you two have a moment, shall I?" "Do." He was gone a moment later, hurrying off with his eternally regal wife on his arm. Left alone, Sakuma had little to do but watch Tobirama preen over his new fur, visually identical to the one he had always worn and yet so different at the same time. The sight made him smile, and he was still wearing an embarrassingly soft expression when Tobirama looked up and met his eyes. Strange that we should be born in different generations and still be matched to each other, the man noted. And lucky that we found each other here in the afterlife. Fascinating, I would say. There was an unusual gleam in his eye, eerily similar to the look Kakashi used to have when he was little and first learning to mold his chakra. Would you, perhaps, care to join me for the afternoon so that we might discuss it? Sakuma wasn't sure if Tobirama wanted to spend time with him or if he was only interested in experimenting somehow with the bond between them, famous even in the history books for his love of science, but it sounded like a good time either way. He finally had a soulmate. Who was he to deny them if they wished him to spend an afternoon at their side? Kakashi simply wasn't going to believe this when they met again. Chapter 156, Zabuza Baruka, the one where you earn feathers for your wings by saving lives. In a village of shinobi, Iruka was a walking exception. Not because he couldn't kill, he could and had taken lives when necessary. It wasn't that he was unwilling to kill because Iruka had been raised in the same village as all his classmates. He taught the shinobi way in class every day. He understood it better than most. What made Iruka such an exception was that, in a village full of men and women who made a career out of taking lives, Iruka made a career out of saving them. He spent the early years of children's lives saving them from themselves, teaching them how to properly throw a kunai and catching the ones that went astray. And after he sent them off into the care of others, there wasn't a year that went by when some young adolescent didn't hunker down during a mission and send a silent thank you to Iruka for teaching them the skills they needed to survive their first real battles. So what truly made Iruka an exception is a village of killers was his wings, full and bright and glorious to behold. Every year he earned dozens of new feathers to replace the ones he lost to the stress of shaping young minds. It was his wings that gave Zabuza pause when they met for the first time, their paths crossing entirely by coincidence or perhaps because the universe had grown tired of waiting. Haku stood poised on the balls of his feet, body centered between the two adult men and arms raised in readiness to remove this obstruction from their path. Iruka tightened his hand around the scroll he was meant to be delivering, a simple mission to occupy him until academy classes started up again, and narrowed his eyes at the unkempt state of the child before him. What kind of cruel man makes his son wear rags in this weather? He asked. What kind of man lets a child fight his battles for him? Hardly an auspicious first impression, they would later admit. Zabuza-san is not my father, but neither does he need to ask anything of me. I fight for him because I wish to. Because he gave my life a purpose, I will protect him at all costs. Haku tapped his chin down and looked up at Iruka through his lashes, innocent and deadly all at once. Iruka looked away first when Zabuza gave a short huff of laughter. My only feather, he said, though that wasn't quite true. Two skeletal frames of bone spread out from his back, mostly bare as shinobi's wings tended to be. Here and there lay the occasional feather of soft gray that denoted a good deed done, but on the tip of his right wing one single white feather had grown, one life saved for all the ones he had taken. Iruka shifted his stance, feather-laden wings spreading out defensively without his notice. They jerked and flared with surprise when Zabuza shrugged his shoulders and turned away. He strolled back down the forest path with a deliberate sort of casualness in the way he moved, and the tone of his voice when he called for Haku was careful underneath the uncaring veneer. Stand down, Haku, there's nothing to be gained from this guy. He isn't worth the effort. Before doing as he was asked, Haku made certain to pause and drag his eyes down and back up Iruka's body, analyzing his stance, gathering as much information as he could from looks alone. Only then did he sheath his weapons and hurry to follow after the master he had chosen to devote himself to. Iruka turned and darted into the trees the second he was no longer in either of their sight lines, not looking a gift horse in the mouth. He had a scroll to deliver, and there was little point in engaging two unknown rogues he couldn't remember seeing the last time he'd glanced idly through the bingo books. If they chose not to see him as a threat, that was their mistake, but he certainly wasn't going to go looking for trouble if they didn't want to bother engaging. They weren't even heading towards Konoha, definitely not his problem. He was already a half-mile away by the time Haku caught up with his master and pressed a hand to his own cheek with awe. Zabuza-sama, you have a new feather. The man in question stopped walking and wrapped the bone frames of his would-be wings around himself, stretching them out until he could see that his ward was correct. He did indeed have another feather, pure white and shining in the dappled afternoon sun. Zabruza hummed and touched the new addition with the tip of one finger. "I wonder," he mumbled under his breathed, "which life I saved. Yours or his?" "His, of course. I would never leave you, Zabruza-sama, so who else's could it be?" Zabruza ignored the declaration, but his fingers lingered on the feather as he thought of how full that stranger's wings had been, mottled through with equal parts grey and white in a way that contrasted directly with how confidently he held his blade. Something in his told him to turn and follow, to go after the man with more feathers than any shinobi had a right to grow, and even as he hesitated he knew that he was going to listen. He had saved a life today, apparently, but I'm not so sure it wasn't mine. Chapter 157, Madara, Tobirama, the one where wounds show up on both of you. It was just a small thing, just a tiny nick he'd given himself while shaving, so he hadn't really given much thought to it when it happened. The collar of his robes was high enough to conceal his neck, and his massive hair had always kept most of him hidden anyway, barely more than half of his face peeking out through the jungle of wild locks. When he left the house that morning, the small cut was already out of his mind, and he didn't think about it again until he was standing across the room from Tobirama with his eyes locked in on the little red spot marring white skin just beside the man's Adam's apple. "Cut yourself shaving," Izuna was saying, teasing his childhood rival turned friend as he usually did. "Someone did," Tobirama replied. "But it was not me." He continued to flip through the papers he was carrying without bothering to look up, unbothered by the implication that he could have been so clumsy as to mark his own skin. Madara ducked his chin lower into his collar. It was only a coincidence, of course. There wasn't a chance in the world that his soulmate was a man he had been working side by side with for almost 5 years now. Surely he would have noticed long before now if that were the case. Madara liked to think he wasn't quite that oblivious. Regardless, the sight of that little cut stuck with him over the next few days, and he found himself staring at it repeatedly until it finally healed. That it healed exactly in time with his own small nick was definitely a factor in keeping the whole business at the forefront of his mind. It reached the point where he absolutely had to know, but there was only one way to find out for sure. He was going to have to cut himself somewhere that would be easy to conceal on himself but readily visible on the one he wanted to say. Should it turn out that he was wrong, he didn't want any questions on why he was marking up his own skin. On the other hand, if he was right, he didn't want it to be obvious until he figured out how to go about revealing his little discovery. Or if he wanted to reveal himself at all. He was sitting in his office before a budget meeting a week later when he finally got tired of his own hesitance and peeled off one of the gloves he always wore, grabbed the closest sharp object, and dug it into the back of his hand. A letter opener probably wasn't the best choice, he realized when the line came out slightly rougher than he intended for it to be, but he'd done it, and that was the important part. He sat there admiring himself for finally having the courage to do something until he realized he could sense Hashirama heading right for him. Panic set in and he tossed the letter opener back in the pen holder on the corner of the desk without cleaning the blood off, lunged for his discarded glove, and pulled it on just as the door opened to admit a flustered man jubbling too many scrolls in his arms. "Where are the reports from the Aburame clan?" Hashirama asked over top of his little mountain. "Your brother has them." "Okay, well, what about the ones from the Hate clan?" "I can see them in that pile you're holding." "The Nara?" Rolling his eyes and praying he didn't bleed right through his glove, Madara stood up to snatch away half of the scrolls that were about to topple to the floor. "For Kami's sake, what has you so worried? You've never cared so much about these stupid budget meetings before. I saw you fall asleep during last month's." "I'm sorry. Mida's been in a terrible mood since the doctor told her she couldn't make her annual trip to Yuzushia this late in her pregnancy. It's making me all flustered too. HMPH. We all have our own problems." He tried for an annoyed growl, but it came out as more of a muted grumble under his breath without any real anger behind it. He remembered what his mother had been like when she was pregnant with Izuna, and he remembered spending as much time away from home as he could in the last couple of months. As his own form of support, he let Hashirama babble on without interruption while they walked to the boardroom together, at which point he completely lost his ability to concentrate on anything but the fact that Tobirama was standing at the head of the room, absently dabbing blood from his hand while he spoke to the Hagane clan head. When he pulled the cloth away, Madara was able to see that the cut he was tending to was in the same spot and made the same shape as the jagged slash he had just given his own hand only a minute ago. Weak-kneed, he slumped down into the closest chair and did his best not to look as shell-shocked as he was feeling while Hashirama called everyone to order. Most of the meeting went completely over his head. Madara sat in his chair and turned his face towards whoever was standing to address the room, but his eyes strayed constantly to the pale bandaged hand wrapping fingernails on the tabletop in a precise rhythm. He still had no idea whether he even wanted to broach the topic or not, even now that he had confirmation there was a topic to broach. Tobirama was hard to read at the best of times. Trying to figure out whether their relationship could be considered friendly or not was an exercise in frustration. While the rest of the world carried on around him, Madara passed away the next 2 hours composing and discarding 7 different speeches in his head. As soon as the meeting was over, he hurried out of the room as fast as he could, skating his eyes past anyone who looked like they might want to stop him to discuss something he knew he just wouldn't be able to care about at the moment. Freedom, however, was a brief victory. He had barely sat back down in his office when the door opened and Tobirama let himself in without knocking. Madara's voice cracked when he tried to speak, and he thanked every god who might possibly be listening that the sound appeared to go unnoticed. Tobirama simply took it as leave to get right to business. "I tried to catch you after the meeting for this, but you left too quickly." The man paused to look him up and down. "Are you feeling all right? You're looking awfully flushed." "Doubly what's it to you?" "All right then, if you're going to be like that. Just look this over and get it back to me by tomorrow." With a roll of his eyes, Tobirama tossed the packet of papers he'd been holding with a negligent flick, clearly not caring for wherever it landed. Where it landed was right up against the pen holder, knocking it over and sending pens cascading all across the desk. It also sent a bloody letter opener spinning out into plain sight. Madara felt panic flood his veins as he all but threw himself across the desk to grab the letter opener, but he was too late. Clearly Tobirama had already seen it. He just barely held in a moan of despair when the other man's hand clamped down on his wrist, stopping him from hiding the evidence. "Your hand is bleeding." "Huh?" Madara followed Tobirama's line of sight to see that he wasn't looking at the bloody implement at all. He was looking at the drying blood smearing out from where it had pulled inside his glove. There was no denying the intent look in Tobirama's eyes. Madara barely had a chance to give a wordless cry of protest before his glove was torn off and his secret was exposed. At least, he consoled himself in the silence that followed. There was no violence. Yet, for what felt like an entire lifetime, neither of them moved. Tobirama stared down at the cut, and Madara could almost see the gears turning inside his head, connecting the dots and coming to the only possible conclusion. He did feel a little better knowing he hadn't been the only one who never realized they were soulmates. "You should take better care of your wounds," Tobirama whispered eventually. From his pocket he pulled out one of the handkerchiefs he always carried, usually as a backup to give to Hashirama when the man started crying, but perfect now for blooding at the still wet smear on Madara's hand. In all the commotion, the fragile clothing had cracked open and begun to bleed again. Or perhaps you should take better care to not cut yourself on the back of your hand with a letter opener on a day when you seem to have no mail to open. Red eyes lifted from where they were still cleaning the wound to pin Madara in place more effectively than any weapon had. "I do so hate cleaning up unexpected blood from my clothing." Madara swallowed thickly. "You are not quite as upset as I had imagined you would be." He was confused to see Tobirama's lips turn up in that devious smile which usually meant he just realized he knew something that no one else did. That confusion was solved when the grip on his hand was used to drag him forward and Tobirama met him over the middle of the desk with a messy kiss. It took a few seconds to remember how to breathe, but by the time he did it was already over and the other man was pulling away. Unable to speak, Madara could only continue to stare with his lips still puckered. "Next time you hurt yourself, just bring it to me." Tobirama smirked as he straightened back to his full height and let their hands slide apart ever so slowly. "I would be more than happy to tend to your wounds if you're not going to take proper care yourself. Behave and I might even kiss them better. I'm not a child. I don't need you to. Of course you don't. If you're amenable, I'd like to discuss this with you a bit more in depth. Say, over dinner tonight." The only answer Madara could give was a gawping stare, but Tobirama didn't seem to mind. He chuckled, leaned over to close Madara's jaw, and then left the office with a smug wink. It was probably the first time he had winked in his entire life, but he still managed to make it look good. Without him, the office felt weirdly empty in a way that it hadn't before he arrived. Madara looked down at the hand he had mutilated earlier, tilting it back and forth with a bemused smile on his face. Apparently he hadn't had anything to worry about. He probably could have just talked to Tobirama about it like a regular functioning adult, and he could have done his little test with a much smaller cut, much less bloodshed. Ah well. He'd earned a dinner with his dramatics, so he chalked that one up as a win. Before going back to work, he made sure to pull out the first aid kit Hashirama had buried in one of his drawers to dress the wound properly. He was going to have to take much better care of himself now that he knew just who he was taking down with him whenever he let himself get hurt. Chapter 158, Guy Tenzo, the one where your black soul mark gains color on first touch. Tenzo was glad of the mask covering his face, grateful for something to hide his face away from the older boy next to him. He had a great deal of respect for his senpai, but Kakashi was very given to teasing when the opportunity presented itself, and someone as unused to spending time with others as Tenzo was presented a lot of opportunities without realizing it. If anyone could have seen his face right, then he was all too aware he would be prime bait for such teasing. The sheer heat coming off of his cheeks at the moment could have boiled water for tea. Just look at him, Kakashi muttered at his side. He never knows when to give it a rest. Tenzo was too busy staring to give a proper answer. He'd heard a lot of things about this Might Guy person, but this was the first time he'd seen the guy. None of the rumors had been enough to prepare him for this sight. Guy had to be around Kakashi-senpai's age, so he was only a few years older than Tenzo. The rest of their age group could be called young adults, but the muscles rippling with every movement Guy made just screamed old man. And the precision. Each push-up was a work of art, each kick landed exactly where it was meant to. Tenzo licked his lips behind the safety of his mask. He sort of hoped Kakashi-senpai would let them stay hidden here in the bushes for a little longer, just so he could take his time appreciating this moving work of art. Whatever kind of prank senpai was probably cooking up could surely wait for another couple of minutes. Unfortunately, it apparently couldn't. He was jerked out of a daze and nearly tripped over his own feet when his senpai clapped him on the back and ushered them both forward into the clearing. Yo, Guy. Rival. The young man leapt out of his one-handed push-up with an ease that had Tenzo stifling a whimper. Where's the rest of your jumpsuit? It isn't like he not to wear a shirt. Guy presented them with an enthusiastic thumbs up that did wonders for his exposed biceps. Then he drooped a little as he scratched his head and looked around in mild confusion. Your question is a worthy one, rival. I know it's around here somewhere. Ma, don't worry about it. I was hoping you'd be up for a spar. Tenzo here needs a new training partner for whenever I'm not around, but I think he should probably see you in action before I inflict you on him without warning. Kakashi turned to offer his fellow A and B a conspiratorial wink, but Tenzo was still staring at Guy with blatant awe, unsteady on his feet but trying not to be obvious about how affected he was. He gurgled low in his throat when the half-naked hunk turned to focus solely on him for a moment. Guy offered him an easy grin and came forward to snatch up his hand, pumping it up and down with both his own and chattering away about how much he would love them to trade together. It was the weirdest handshake he'd ever been a part of, but it was so worth it to see all that muscles from so close up. Guy was dripping with sweat, had clearly been exercising for quite some time already, yet he just as clearly still had plenty of energy to spare. Shall we get started, my rival? Guy spun around and strode back over to where he had been before, running through a few stretches as though he weren't already plenty limbered up. Kakashi coughed in surprise. Up, Guy? What limits shall we set ourselves? A good shinobi should always be looking for a new challenge. Guy, you're back. Tenzo was staring too, feeling vaguely lightheaded. Where the young man's back had just a moment ago been covered in the black sprawl of an unfulfilled soul mark, it was suddenly lit up with color now. Several different shades of green made up the leaves of a tree that stretched from shoulder to waistline, sturdy trunk disappearing under the belt he had made of his Konoha headband. That his mark had been dark up until the two of them had shaken hands could only mean one thing. You've got, colors. Kakashi coughed again, shifting uncomfortably. No, I haven't. Guy craned his neck to try and see his own back. I won't have colors until I meet my Colors? Fat tears of joy welled up in his eyes immediately as he proved wrong all the rumors that he was at all unintelligent, turning immediately to stare at Tenzo with a hopeful if wobbly expression. Behind the mask, Tenzo was busily trying to remember how breathing worked. This would definitely explain why he'd been born with a soul mark shaped like a set of dumbbells. He had a sudden urge to lift his pad leg to see how the image was different now since it was clear it would finally be in color. My soulmate. Oh, this is wonderful. Can you believe it? But of course my eternal rival would lead my soulmate to me. Words poured forth like an endless fountain as Guy went on and on about how happy he was until finally he paused for breath after nearly 10 minutes when he thought to ask, "Won't you take off your mask? I should like to see what my own soulmate looks like." Right, okay. I already know what he looks like, I'm going to take off. Kakashi saluted them both with 2 fingers, disappearing in a puff of smoke. It was just like him to escape when things got emotional. Tenzo breathed deeply under the weight of Guy's unshifting gaze. The man was gorgeous and it only made him think about how plain he looked himself. For a moment he considered not taking off the mask, just bolting like his senpai had, but he forced himself to stay and be brave. His fingers were trembling a little with confused emotions as he reached up to take hold of his painted mask and draw it off slowly, more aware than ever of the heat still lingering in his cheeks. With a delighted gasp, Guy's face lit up in his brightest smile yet. Stupendous. You're a masterpiece to behold. Oh, I am. Of course. Those soulful eyes, such expressive lips, the jawline of my dreams. You are everything I could have wished for you to be and more. With your uniform clearly you have great skill, and with your choice of company I can only compliment your taste in friends. Kakashi-senpai is my only friend, he felt compelled to admit. Guy waved him off easily. You have another now in me. He wasn't sure if that meant they would only have a platonic bond or if Guy meant for their eventual romance to be based in friendship first, but either way sounded wonderful to him. Seeing someone else so happy to have him near made Tenzo think that, whatever Guy had in store for them, he had no doubts that their future together would be a happy one. Chapter 159, Sai Shino, the one where your soulmate must say your name. Finding his soulmate was easy. In his attempts to learn the rules of socializing properly, Sai had developed the habit of repeating back every new piece of information he was given. Repetition helped with memory, after all. The first time he was introduced to Aburame Shino, he had repeated the name in a quiet mumble, and that was that. He had found the person his soul was meant to be bound to. Shino described the feeling of knowing as 1,000 insects vibrating through every inch of his body while feeling the jolt of a low-level raendown at the same time. Sai would have loved to experience that feeling for himself. And that would have been easy if only he knew what his own name was. Even years later it seemed Root was still finding ways to take more away from him. Long before the organization had been disbanded, Danza had destroyed most of the evidence that might prove his involvement in certain deeds. Among the evidence that got destroyed were the records of all the souls whose lives had been devoted to Root, their origins, their families, the places they had belonged to before they were taken and erased and remade. Without those records, Sai had no way of ever knowing what name he was meant to bear. It wasn't exactly a massive impediment to their lives, to be honest. Shino knew that they were soulmates and Sai believed him that they were, had never once entertained the possibility that he might be lying. After getting to know each other, it was easy to tell that Shino was not the sort to make up tales or to hurt other people without reason. So not knowing his own name hardly prevented them from being together. But that didn't stop him from wondering about it from time to time, what it would be like to have that moment of perfect assurance that he was indeed following the right path. Raikucha. Shino appeared at his side quietly, breaking in upon his musing. No, not that one. Dinner is ready, Hiroki. Sai turned away from the window and shook his head as they moved towards the kitchen. Not that one. His partner didn't even bother to look put off. This had been a game between them since only a couple of months after they got together, Shino guessing at random names while Sai amusedly turned them all down. Neither of them truly expected it to ever work, but at this point it had almost become a form of using pet names more than anything else. Would you like sauce, Masaaki? Not that one. No thank you. Have you heard from Naruto yet? I have. He sent word that their team arrived early. That is not surprising. Shino clacked his chopsticks together to shoo one of his beetles away from their meal. Why? Because Lee is a part of their team and Lee does not arrive anywhere less than early. Sai nodded sullenly. He had hoped to go on this mission himself until he learned that Lee would be joining them. As much as he enjoyed the company of everyone in his growing group of friends, he still preferred not to go on missions with the other young man. Lee confused him sometimes with so much endless enthusiasm. Would you pass the rice please, Akihiko? Not that one. Here you are. Shino spooned himself a bit more rice and then reached for the vegetable mix he had thrown together, a nameless mishmash of all the things left in the fridge that he'd wanted to use up before it all went bad. Would you like more as well, Ryu? He murmured. A few seconds of silence went by before he realized that the usual denial had not come. Curious, Shino lifted his head to see Sai with his chopsticks drooping loosely from his hand, eyes wide with shock. Worry seeped in and he reached across the table to brush his fingers against his partner's wrist. Are you all right? That one, Sai whispered, is a shaken voice. Say that one again. Ryu? Oh. That one is my name. Neither of them moved for a long time, hardly able to process that they had stumbled upon his true name entirely by accident or that the soulmate bond had activated without the inclusion of the Klein name. There could be a dozen reasons for that, answers which might have led him to a past he'd never had an opportunity to know, but what Sai cared about most was what this meant for their future, what it meant for the two of them right now in this present moment. They had found his name. He had felt the sensation of knowing that several people had described for him but that he thought he would never experience himself. It was different, knowing Shino was his soulmate intellectually and knowing it with his entire being. Appropriate, Shino broke the silence eventually. Sai tilted his head curiously. Is it? He watched Shino twist to reach out for a notebook sitting on the kitchen counter nearby. Yes. Why? Because Ryu, when written with these kanji, means beautiful form. Your parents gave you no expectations to grow into but that they would always think you are beautiful in their eyes. Sai traced his eyes over the kanji written for him several times before deciding that he liked it. They made me a blank slate, he noted. To be whatever you wanted to be, Shino agreed. I want to be yours. No matter how many times he said things like that, it would always be strange to express his emotions so openly. But it was worth it to see the quiet smile as Shino brushed fingers against his wrist again. You are mine, Ryu. Chapter 160, Madara Tobarama, the one where you have a mark showing their opinion. Tobarama was born with blood on his hip, a dark splash of red to represent a boy who was only 3 years old at the time but who had already made his first kill, a boy who hated him before they even knew of each other's existence just because of the clan name he bore. Tobarama was born with blood on his hip but he was a babe who could care less. The only person who worried then was his mother. By the time he could walk and talk, his mark had changed to a blade, sharp and bright and so realistic he sometimes reached out to grasp the handle without thinking. He understood vaguely what it meant, but he was only a year old and the concepts of love or hate were just words to him. What Tobarama understood was that any time he overheard his father speak the word Uchiha, it was with anger and it made him angry too. He didn't know what an Uchiha was, but Tobarama knew that he didn't like them. At 10 years old his mark had softened, the blade covered with a scabbard. Each time he bathed, soaking alone with nothing but his thoughts to occupy him, Tobarama took a few moments to admire the intricate designs printed across his skin while no one was there to see him looking. It was commonly accepted in his family that the one he was bound to was probably an enemy, and Tobarama understood he would probably never get to be with them, yet he could never quite manage to entirely smother the small corner of his heart that would forever carry a fond thought for the blade that rested on his skin, always close yet never piercing. When he was 11, the length of the blade shortened, still tucked away in its scabbard, but less a sword and more of a dagger. It felt significant somehow, even if he couldn't fathom why. Then he turned 12, and among the ruckus of discovering Hashirama cavorting with an Uchiha, breaking up their friendship as he was ordered to do, and having his first big fight with the only brother he had left, it took a while before he noticed that his mark had changed again. Wrapped around the handle and spilling down one side of the scabbard there were now dozens of hawthorn blossoms. Tobarama stared when he discovered them, tracing the pretty shapes with his fingers and wondering what could have changed to wrap a symbol of hope around a softened blade. His 18th birthday exposed the blade again on the day he nearly killed Azuna for the first time. It was a hard battle and he had come out the clear victor, but his opponent was not the only one wounded. His bathwater was stained red with blood seeping from still open wounds that Hashirama pretended not to see, upset with him for almost taking away his last path to peace. Tobirama's heart was heavy with hot anger and betrayal, tight with an invisible hurt he would never admit to when he finally noticed the change. Without its scabbard, bright steel cut through the hawthorn petals to make them bleed, and Tobirama forgot to breathe for a few moments, finally understanding the many changes his mark had gone through. It was not a happy realization. Covering the mark had always been easy considering its location, so it wasn't like anything changed about his day-to-day life now that he understood who his soulmate was. The only thing that changed were the days when his father led them in battle against the Uchiha, and Tobirama taught himself to make his movements just a little bit slower, to use his precision just a little to the side. He taught himself mercy against an enemy he hated and wondered what the point of it was when none of them would ever live to see the peace his brother still dreamed about sometimes. On the day Batsuma fell, however, things changed. It felt like the fall of the first domino crashing into the next until events were happening around them so fast he could hardly keep track. One clan had fell, then another, two sons stepped up, and Tobirama almost didn't believe his eyes the day he saw Madara take Hashirama's hand. The mark riding on his hip shifted and changed in small ways as Madara learned more about him and his opinions changed over time. Not that the changes were always obvious whether they were good or bad, but Tobirama paid close attention to them all the same, always curious to see what new impressions he had given, interested to know what mark represented his own opinion, but not at all willing to ask about it. He wondered sometimes if Madara had ever suspected their bond, but never once did he consider bringing it up. Not while his skin bore steel against the vein, beautiful yet deadly and clearly a threat. No matter what sort of good changes appeared, nothing truly positive could ever be meant by a mark shaped like a weapon. Or so he thought. The day the Uchiha and Senju met at the foot of the mountain that bore the memories of a childhood friendship, the very day that two clans met to work together in harmony for the first time in countless generations, they were of course sabotaged by several other clans working in tandem. An alliance like the one they had made was all too easy to mistake as a threat to all others. And of course the only way Shinobi knew how to deal with the threat was to attack first. Fighting side by side with the Uchiha was a unique experience for everyone involved. Aiming his jutsu past Azuna rather than towards Azuna was just different enough to distract Tobirama from the spinning blades of air coming towards him from an enemy FTON. He never even saw his death coming until a solid body had planted itself in front of him and Madara was bracing against his war fan, deadly jutsu rendered harmless as it was redirected upwards away from the battle. When the danger had passed, he fully expected the Uchiha clan had to move on, but instead Tobirama was baffled to see Madara take up position to cover his flank, stand solid and unmovable in a way he usually only saw in someone covering their tain's retreat. It was defensive stance, and it made him wonder if Madara realized he was protecting the wrong brother. Still, he wasn't stupid enough to not take advantage of some extra cover. With each of the two strongest fighters from both the Uchiha and the Senju working together, they decimated the idiots trying to sabotage their alliance in almost no time at all, leaving it up to the medics who dashed in afterwards to decide whether or not the lives of their wounded assailants were worth saving. Before Tobirama had a chance to quit the field, he found his way blocked by too much hair and a distractingly attractive face. "Be more careful," Madara demanded bluntly. Tobirama eyed him suspiciously. "What's it to you if I live or die?" he drawled. The only possible answer he expected was something to do with Hashirama and how annoying it would be to listen to the man cry about it for the next decade. He was startled by the uncomfortable shift of Madara's weight and the hesitant pause before he leaned closer to speak low, quiet so he would not be overheard. No matter how deadly, a blade will always have two purposes. To take lives, his eyes bored into Tobirama's, gaze heavy and intent. And to protect them. His piece spoken, Madara turned on his heel and marched away without waiting for an answer. Tobirama watched him go in bemusement, wondering what the hell that was all about. It wasn't until he had left the battlefield, been fussed over by his brother, then found a nice quiet place to unwind that it finally struck him, the meaning behind Madara's cryptic words. The shock of him nearly sent him tumbling backwards off the rock he had perched himself upon to clean his weaponry after the battle. Jerking himself back upright with a stiff back, Tobirama looked off in the vague direction he could feel Madara's chakra burning from. It seemed they were going to need to have that conversation he'd been avoiding all this time anyway, and he already had 100 questions to ask when they did. First and foremost of which would be, how the hell did Madara know what the mark on his it looked like? Chapter 161, Madara, Tobirama, the one where you sleep at the same time. The first night wasn't usually all that bad as long as he hadn't done anything particularly strenuous that day. Madara was used to spending a solid 24 hours awake at a time, just like everyone else who had grown up running missions from the day he learned how to hold a blade. Even the second night wasn't always terrible in the right circumstances. It had saved his life on a number of occasions when he would have fallen asleep if left to his own devices and possibly left himself vulnerable in enemy territory. Being forced to stay awake on those nights was as useful as it was annoying. Usually it was the third night that pushed him over the edge. Despite what the rumors might say, Madara was as human as the next guy. He liked to get his minimum 6 hours a night when he could. So being forced to stay awake for 3 nights in a row just because some other asshole didn't know when to pack it intended to wear on his temper just a little. And considering how short his temper was on a good day, it never spelled anything good for the poor souls he inflicted himself upon when Madara stumped out of his home on the 32nd hour of straight consciousness without rest. Citizens and subordinates leapt out of his path all the way to the tower until Madara was standing hunched over like a creature reborn from its grave, staring across the desk at a very worried-looking Hashirama. "You don't look so good," his friend told him, an inane statement if he had ever heard one. Of course Madara knew he didn't look very well. He didn't feel very well. "It's your brother's bloody fault," he snapped in return. "If he doesn't come out of that hellhole he calls a lab soon, I'm going to pass out and drag him down with me. See how he likes it." Curling his fingers into angry claws, he almost missed the way Hashirama brightened at his words. "Oh, that's a good idea. Would you like me to knock you out?" "No, of course I don't want you to knock me out, you idiot." Madara hissed and threw himself down into one of the squishy visitor chairs. Hashirama wilted for a few seconds until he twisted to tap thoughtfully at his chin. "Why don't you just go in the lab and tell him to sleep? If he sees how it's making you, I'm sure he'll agree to take at least a short break. He's not entirely heartless, just very distractible." "I can't. The damn asshole warded his lab so I can't get in." "Why would he ward his lab against you?" "Not me specifically." Madara huffed impatiently, no temper left to wait for the other man to keep up with him. "Those brats he calls students keep breaking into his lab and hurting themselves, so he strengthened the wards, but now I can't get in either. When he shows his face again, I'm going to cave it in with my fist." Just to drive home the point, he shook one fist weakly in the general direction of where Tobirama's labs were set up on the far side of the village. He ignored the falsely impressed expression Hashirama made, an attempt to keep his spirits up that did nothing more than annoy him further. Visibly bracing to be rejected, Hashirama offered hesitantly, "Would you like me to try to get him out?" Yes." "Fine." Hashirama had an advantage that he didn't. With Mokiden he could open a wall even through the barrier of protective wards. Normally he would refuse help and stubbornly insist on solving his problems by himself, but he was all too aware that his thought process had lost its last shine of clarity 12 hours ago. He could hardly think straight. How was he supposed to figure out how to break past advanced level warding seals in this condition? Hashirama looked startled by his agreement, but he was blessedly quick to leap into action, for which Madara was grateful. Every minute awake was agony at this point. His eyes felt like they were coated with sand, his limbs were as heavy as mountains, and there was a pounding in his head that hadn't let up since yesterday. All he wanted was sleep. And only Tobirama had the power to ground him that. They used a quick body flicker to travel across the village with Madara clinging to his friend's arm while the other man aimed their trajectory. He didn't want to know where he might end up if he tried to use that jutsu himself in this state. As soon as they arrived, he marched right up to the very edge of the invisible boundary just outside the door and planted his feet, arms crossed, to wait for a way forward. Hashirama offered him a conciliatory pat before quickly getting to work before any tempers could fly free. Clearly Tobirama was not expecting the eastern wall of his workshop to open itself outward and expose him to sunlight. The expression on his face would have been absolutely priceless if Madara had been awake enough to appreciate it, the way his jaw fell open to hang slack and his red-rimmed eyes grew wider and wider until they looked almost in danger of falling out. Hashirama released the seal he had used to shift the wood and waved to his little brother. "Time for bed, Toby," he called. "Madara's getting cranky." "I'll show you cranky." Madara turned and immediately redirected his irritation to the idiot standing next to him. Hashirama dodged him with a laugh, the two of them running in circles until Tobirama appeared to intercept him. The idiot looked just as half-dead as Madara felt, but he probably hadn't noticed his own body giving out underneath him, too caught up in the discovery of whatever the focus of his latest research binge was. "You look tired," he said critically. Madara snarled. "It's your fault. Shall we to bed, love?" Blinking with astonishment at how easy that had been, none of the pushback he had expected, he almost didn't notice as he was bundled up and trotted off towards home. It felt like the very next moment he was tucked up in bed with Tobirama wrapped around him like an octopus. Sparing an irritated glance for his soulmate, Madara swore revenge upon the idiot, a brutal one, the kind of revenge that even his enemies would be loath to suffer. Then he cuddled back into the warmth of his favorite, beloved idiot to get some well-deserved rest first. Revenge could come after a good long nap. Chapter 162, Kakashi Guy, the one where you have a timer on your wrist for when you meet. "Oh, this is it. This is the perfect spot." Kakashi tilted his head and looked out over the lake with a critical eye, his only eye, incidentally. "Are you sure?" he asked. "Definitely." Obito held his hands out in front of him in a square shape like a viewfinder. "Yep, beautiful. Can't you see it? This is a great place for taking pictures. For you maybe, you nature freak. I prefer human subjects. And I'm noticing a distinct lack of anyone around here." Kakashi waited until Obito rolled his eyes and looked away before pushing up his sleeve to peek at the glowing numbers on the inside of his wrist. His timer only had a minute or so left on it, and he didn't see how the hell he was supposed to meet his soulmate here in this empty public park with no one around but the idiot he'd been best friends with since childhood. He already knew Obito. His soulmate could not be Obito, and he wouldn't want it to be. They already knew too many embarrassing secrets about each other. But if it wasn't his partner in crime, then he didn't see anyone else around for the job either. Was he supposed to match to himself or something? Kakashi was no stranger to self-love, but that was taking it a bit too far if you asked him. "Come on. I want to play with the reflections on the water. My camera's all set up already. I knew this spot would be great." Obito was practically dancing a jig as he hurried over to the nearby lake, but Kakashi shifted the weight of his own camera from hand to hand and lingered behind. "Ma," he grumbled. "I get to choose the spot next time. This park is so empty." Something in the back of his mind told him he would find good things around the thicket of trees just west of where they had set up, and Kakashi had yet to see his photographer's instinct let him down. If his timer was going to end in a bust, he figured he might as well console himself with some great pictures for his portfolio. Freelance photography didn't exactly pay great. It was always a good idea to have lots of things to attract more customers with. The closer he wandered to the trees, the more Kakashi came to realize he could hear something from behind them. Curious, he stopped to listen until he could make out what sounded like a man counting off numbers. Now equal parts baffled and curious, he wandered over and peeked around the trees. 93, 94. What he was counting was push-ups, and who it was turned out to be the beefiest man Kakashi had ever laid eyes on. Muscles on top of muscles, legs for days, and enough of a tan on all that exposed flesh to let him know this guy went shirtless quite regularly. Kakashi's plan, if he had time to make one, would have been to stay hidden and observe like the socially stupid gremlin his friends always accused him of being. That plan was thwarted even before its conception, as his suddenly weak knees wobbled and the stagger to regain his balance brought him out in the open, in full view of the man he'd just stumbled upon by accident. His heart almost stopped when the timer on his wrist did, the very moment their eyes met for the first time. And that was only half of the surprise. Nothing could have prepared him for the 1,000-watt smile he suddenly found himself basking in, the brilliance of the joy that bore down on him to lift his entire body off the ground for a hug seemingly with no effort whatsoever. At last the springtime of my youth has arrived. The joy of my life. The light of my heart. I could not possibly be happier. The man punctuated his words with a tight squeeze that forced a protesting squeak out of Kakashi. "Can't breathe," he whimpered. "Oh. My sincerest apologies, soulmate." Kakashi found himself back on the ground immediately with a massive hand thumping him on the back in a manner that was clearly meant to be comforting but mostly just made him worry about cracking a rib. "Are you all right?" the stranger asked him. Kakashi wheezed and gave a wobbly thumbs up. "Excellent. But of course my soulmate could only be the most hip and cool man around. My name is Might Guy. And yours?" If he smiled any wider, his teeth might drop out. It was a little charming, actually, to see so much enthusiasm, particularly because it seemed to be genuine. "My name is Kakashi. A most youthful name. I can already see how we'll get on well together. Would you like to join me in finishing my workout? Only 106 push-ups left to go, and then I will do 100 sit-ups. What better way to get to know each other than to test our limits side by side? No. You go ahead. I'll just watch." Guy punched one fist into the air with a cry of a yosh, and then he was down on his hands, chattering away as he continued with his workout. Still a little dazed, Kakashi lowered himself down to sit on the grass and listened more carefully than he usually would have to anyone else. He watched with fascination as Guy completed the push-ups and moved seamlessly into the next exercise like it was nothing, barely even seeming to feel the effort. Kakashi was poking thoughtfully at his own underdeveloped abdominal muscles when he heard Obita calling out in the distance, sparking a bit of guilt when he realized he'd forgotten his friend was even here. "Bakasha, where do you go? You not still but hurt over the park idea, are you? Look, just let me take a few more shots and then we can go somewhere you like." "No, that's fine, Obita." He tilted his head to watch Guy from a different angle, smiling and hefting his camera as he murmured gently to himself, "I like where I'm just fine." Chapter 163, Madara, Tobirama, Bazuna, the one where cheating on your soulmate causes physical pain. They were still pretty young when they discovered they were soulmates, the two babies of 5 siblings and both born with a bleeding leaf on their left shoulders. When their ages were both still in the single digits, neither of them understood why the adults always shook their heads with sympathetic frowns upon learning they had matching marks. Soulmates were supposed to be a good things as far as they understood the idea, and they had already decided to be best brothers forever. So what was the problem? It wasn't until Madara hit puberty and tried to kiss another boy his age behind the dining hall that they realized the downfall of their connection, that neither of them would ever be able to seek a sexual relationship, that they would never know the touch of another's hand upon their bodies. They would never learn to kiss, and they wouldn't know what it felt like to fall in love. Honestly, if they didn't love each other so much, they would hate each other for all they had been denied by this match. Once they got used to the idea, it wasn't so bad. Sure, they both had a certain amount of jealousy and yearning beating under their hearts as they watched the rest of their clan fall in love and act all cute in public. And of course it was annoying to know that if they hadn't found each other so young, they would have had a chance to experience those things themselves before the bond formed. But it was a fact they had to live with, and there was no point getting too upset about something they couldn't change. Life went on. In time they did find some new advantages to being brother soulmates. Izuna was particularly fond of having twice the power to guilt-trip Madara when he felt he was owed something. Sometimes it was the last piece of inarizushi at dinner, sometimes it was the continuation of a generations-long war. "You going to accept that buffoon's offer of peace, aren't you?" Izuna sighed as he draped himself across the cushions surrounding Madara's desk and pillowed his head on the man's thigh. "What makes you say that?" Madara hedged. "I can practically smell a bad decision on the wind." "Don't be cynical." His brother reached down to absently pet his hair. "You don't know Hashirama like I do. When he offers peace, he means it. This isn't a trap." Tilting his chin away just so, Izuna heaved a heavy sigh. "You don't know that." "No. That won't work this time, little brother. Sigh all you want, but no amount of dough is going to change my mind on this. It's for the best. It's for your own good. Making peace with the Senju means I won't have to wake up every day wondering if this is the day I will lose you too." Izuna swallowed thickly and rolled himself back into an upright position, not meeting his brother's eyes. They both felt the empty spaces where the rest of their family used to fill their two-big house, listened to the quiet where the evening night used to be filled with the sound of their mother singing their elder sister to sleep. Disquieted with the reality slapping him in the face, Izuna scrambled to his feet and prowled over to the window on the opposite side of the room. Fine, he mumbled softly as he set his eyes east, piercing through the buildings and the trees between them to pretend he could stare right into the center of the Senju compound. But if this goes belly up, then I'm going to take great pleasure in saying "I told you so" at least 24 times. I admire your restraint, Madara told him in a dry voice. Izuna preened. He had always enjoyed being admired. Since it was clearly inevitable that his brother planned on leading them all into doom, Izuna hardly bothered with trying to look aggressive the next time their troops faced off against Senju forces. Tobirama held himself in a defensive position with his weapon at the ready like always, but Izuna only propped a hand on one hip and jerked his head towards their siblings with a roll of his eyes. The handshake that changed the course of all their fates was interrupted when Hashirama, in typical idiotic fashion, went into spasms of joy and began to weep over how happy he was. Madara let him get 3 minutes into a tear-filled speech before he started yelling, and the two of them descended into a comical back and forth that left no doubts they had once been the best of friends, that they could rebuild their friendship now they had a chance to. Izuna was more amused than offended to see the look of despairing surrender his old rival gave to him. Clearly the man didn't see the point in fighting his brother's decision, but clearly he had also been hoping, just as Izuna himself had been, that peace would remain as nothing more than a nightmarish maybe. Ah, cheer up, Toads. The Senju's strongest female fighter came forward to knock a solid fist against Tobirama's arm. If you need someone to swing a sword at, I'll fight you. No thank you, Tuka. His mouth pinched together with distaste and she laughed. Don't be so grumpy. Maybe you'll finally find who that bleeding leaf of yours is meant for, huh? Imagine. She began to laugh, a strange counterpoint to the way Izuna's heart had just skipped several beats. Oh man, can you imagine if your soulmate was an Uchiha? Purposefully not watching the man's reaction to that statement, Izuna turned and hollered across the field. Aniki! Shut up and get over here. Now. Madara took a minute or so to extract himself from his argument with Hashirama. He was clearly having the time of his life, though it might not have looked like it to anyone who didn't know him well, so he must have heard the heaviness in Izuna's tone to answer his call so quickly. When he came over, it was with a scowl for being interrupted but an undeniable curiosity in his eyes. What? He demanded shortly. Izuna swallowed anxiously as he turned to catch Tobirama's eye, one hand reaching up to pull down the extra wide collar of his robe and expose the front of his left shoulder. She said, your soul mark looks like a bleeding leaf. Does it look something like this, by any chance? He didn't need an answer. The answer was implied by the way Tobirama fumbled backwards into his cousin, weak-kneed with shock, and the way he dropped his sword to reach up and press that hand against his armor where it covered the same spot on his own shoulder. It was nice to be right, Izuna mused. While the other two of their apparent trio reeled through the waves of disbelief, Izuna's mind was already racing ahead to other things. He was leering when he leaned over and bopped his knuckles against Madara's, keeping eye contact with Tobirama as he spoke. I suppose you and I are going to have to learn how to share, hun. Even more delicious than the thought that he might finally figure out what all the fuss was about kissing, Izuna's ultimate triumph was putting such a vibrant blush across Tobirama's pretty pale cheeks. Chapter 164, Hashirama up Izuna, the one where you hear their thoughts on contact. Hashirama felt bad for the blatant surprise on his face when the man he had just stumbled across shot him a pinched expression full of deep offense. It wasn't that he wasn't willing to fight Izuna, they were both shinobi and he did understand that not everyone shared his drains for peace. He had been raised like the rest to protect his kin in any way that was necessary. He was just a little startled to break a comfortable pattern, that was all. The last time he fought an Uchiha that wasn't Madara was probably close to a decade ago. Usually he preferred to avoid their patrols even if he got an exasperated lecture from Tobirama about giving their clan a bad reputation. Coming across Izuna when they were both alone in the forest was entirely unexpected. Maybe he should think about asking his brother for pointers learning how to increase his sensing capabilities, because he hadn't even felt the other man there until they were all but on top of each other. Senju scum, Izuna greeted him, the muscles of his legs coiling with redness. Hashirama held up his hands. Oh, come on, do we have to? I don't want to hurt Madara's last brother. Don't underestimate me. Hashirama winced, recognizing that he had offended the other even more. That truly hadn't been his intention. It was just that Tuka had been on his back lately to recognize his own strength and be more assertive. Which, really, was unnecessary. He knew he could have crushed Madara like and a long time ago if that was what he wanted, but it wasn't what he wanted. All right, he sighed reluctantly. If we must fight, then I suppose we must. But that didn't mean he was going to even think about going full out. If he wasn't willing to bring his full strength to bear against Madara, who could almost match him in some ways, then he certainly wasn't going to do so now against Azuna. Try not to sound too worried, came the dry snark from his opponent. Hashirama smiled. He'd grown up with Tobirama hissing moodily in his ear. It would take a lot more than one little quip to ruin his mood. When Azuna raised his sword, Hashirama did the same with the air of a man tasked with an unwanted chore. Something about that seemed to rub his opponent the wrong way because Azuna was snarling with irritation as he leapt forward, swinging his blade with careful precision. He would have removed Hashirama's head if he hadn't blocked in time. Their weapons clashed, straining against each other for a moment before they sprang apart to readjust their angles and come in for the attack again. Their sword styles actually seemed to cancel each other out quite nicely, Hashirama noted, which was funny considering they had never faced each other before and likely never would again. Even if this was sort of fun in a strange kind of way, he knew very well that he would never allow Tobirama to face Madara. He loved his friend, but he didn't trust the man not to go for the kill if the opportunity rose. Madara was enthusiastic about very few things, and battle was one of them. After the dozenth or so time they clashed blades with no clear advantages to each side, Izuna was the first to try something different. It wasn't that hard to block his kick, but Hashirama nearly stumbled and fell back on his ass when suddenly there was a flash of thought in his head that did not belong to him. Should watch out for that, he probably. The thought stopped as soon as they stumbled apart from each other. He expected the other man to come at him again, but Azuna only stood there with a shell-shocked expression on his face, sword drooping far below what could be considered an angle for attack. Both of them hung suspended for several minutes until Hashirama decided that if he wanted to make sure what he thought just happened actually did happen, then he was going to have to move. Slowly, tentatively, watching the other man for any signs of attacks, he carefully shuffled forward until he was just close enough to reach out and touch one finger to Azuna's wrist. Immediately that same voice was back inside his head. But then that would mean we are soulmates and Anarchy is going to be so upset about. Izuna jerked his hand away, presumably startled to hear someone else's thought inside his head as well. Amazing, Hashirama murmured. This is amazing. Is it though? Yes. Don't you think so? The smile already forming wilted and he toed the ground with uncertainty. He waited anxiously until Azuna worked himself up to saying, I dunno. It's just weird. We are enemies. But we don't have to be. Anyway, isn't it amazing on its own? To find my soulmate anywhere, even if you were my blackest enemy, don't you think it's an amazing thing to finally know who the universe thinks my soul will resonate with the most? Oh. Huh. I guess I've never thought of it like that. Taking a chance, Hashirama stepped forward again and clasped the edge of Azuna's sleeve, making a friendly connection between them without forcing his thoughts upon the other man. Please, won't you take a few moments away from what we are supposed to be and just, I would like to get to know you. Just you, Azuna, and me, Hashirama, with no client names and no expectations. All I ask is one conversation. With a shrug he offered a wry smile. If you want to after that, we can go back to fighting. He held his breath as the other gave his words some thought, which was honestly more than he had dared to hope for. Then his breathing hitched and caught in his chest as the most wonderful thing happened. Looking away and keeping his expression disinterested, Izuna carefully lowered his arm until it brushed against the fingers Hashirama had twisted in his sleeve, opening the connection between them of his own volition and allowing Hashirama to listen to his thoughts where the words would not come to his lips. I guess I can stay. He makes a good point, and there's something about his eyes that makes me trust his words. And is kind of cute. The flow stopped when he pulled away again, clearly embarrassed by the turn of his own musings. Hashirama just barely stopped himself from sweeping his soulmate in for a tight hug. Getting stabbed would probably be a step in the wrong direction, though it certainly would be worth it. It looked like peace was finally within his grasp, and yet Hashirama found that he had something else to be even more excited about. Nothing else in the world could have made him happier than knowing that he had found his soulmate, and Azuna, despite generations of bloodshed and cycles of death, was willing to put all of that aside to listen to his words for just a few moments, just to be with him as he had always wanted. Chapter 165, Shisui Sakura, the one where you have a mark that glows brighter when you are close. A beacon, she had taken to calling it. Sakura stared at the mark on her wrist, coated with dirt and blood and still shining as it always did to some degree. It was more than just a small tattoo, more than just a little light to prove she had discovered that one out of hundreds of millions. You can do this, she grunted to herself, gnashing the words out between her teeth. Get up. Get up. Every muscle in her body screamed with protest, but she forced herself to keep going until she had rolled back onto all fours and then paused to gulp down oxygen like a drowning woman. It took a couple minutes before she could crack one eye open and stare down at the lifeline on her wrist, the one thing she had left to keep her going. Making it back to her feet was an agony like she had never experienced before. Walking was a chore, it was moving mountains with every step and shattered breathing with every inhale. If there was someone there to ask, she would not have been able to say where the pain was coming from. Hours had passed since the pain from her wounds had all banded together to become the same white noise screaming constantly in the back of her mind. She would have screamed herself if she had the energy. One more step and then another. 2 more feet and then 3. Sakura made her way through the forest on instinct alone, with her eyes locked at all times on her soul mark, guiding her steps by the light it gave off. It was more than a mark. To her it was a beacon, a guide, a force that drove her onwards when she would have given in shortly after the last of her chakra reserves ran dry, leaving her unable to heal herself, unable to keep the pain at bay any longer. For it to shine this bright she must have been close, and to give up this close was unacceptable. With her eyes locked on the twisting lines that decorated her skin, Sakura was watching too intently to notice at first that the light was glowing steadily brighter. Or maybe that was the bloodlust making her woozy and stealing away her concentration. Her eyes wavered in and out of focus until finally it registered that the light had increased just in time for her left knee to collapse and give out from underneath her. Her body tumbled down to the forest floor, head pillowed on a bed of grass and twigs, and Sakura watched the light grow brighter while her vision faded to black. She woke to brilliance. The mark on her wrist filled the darkened hospital room with the purest white radiance, a shining clarity that could only mean one thing. A smile stretched her lips as she turned her head to see the man waiting at her bedside, eyes closed and hands clasped, mouthing a silent prayer to anything that might be listening. You found me, she croaked, syllables rasping against her dry throat. Shisui's eyes popped open and his body tensed with shock. Oh. Awake. You're awake. Water. He all but dove across the room to fetch a pitcher of water from by the window, pouring out a small glass and tossing in a straw so he could hustle back over and gently hold it up for her to take a few sips. Thank you, she whispered. Catching his bottom lip between his teeth, Shisui brushed her hair back and took a deep, tremulous breath. No. Thank you, love. Thank you for holding on. You called me home. Sakura lifted her arm and marveled at how little pain the movement caused. I followed your light because I promised. You made me promise. That you would always come home, he finished the thought for her. Shisui closed his eyes again, overwhelmed for a moment. Came home for you. Tired. Sleep? The drugs in her 4 lines were already pulling her back down again, slurring her words, fogging her brain until all she could do was smile tiredly and hope that it was at least somewhat reassuring. Her partner shooshed her and pet her hair just the way she liked. Yeah, sleep. I'll be here when you wake up again. Safe, sound, and surrounded by light, Sakura let the darkness take her again, knowing she had nothing to fear from it. Chapter 166, Madara Tobarama, the one where you have matching marks. Rugged, gritty battle. A clash of titans. All-out war between the Uchiha and the Senju with no mercy and no fear. Well, that was how Madara had put it when he invited them to play paintball this afternoon. For Tobarama, the experience so far had involved a lot of sitting up a tree and sniping dark-haired idiots from a distance. Which, he had to admit, was much more fun than any of the plans he had cancelled because Hashirama begged him to come along. He was going to cherish the memory for years to come of Azuna flopping on the ground like a fish with paint splattered directly between his shoulder blades. Now, however, he had been presented with the holy grail of opportunities. Madara probably thought he was clever to have snuck into the area of the playing field that had been taken over as the Senju base of operations. The poor idiot didn't realize that the roots he was crawling over were from the very tree Tobirama had been camped in for the past 2 hours. Also that he was a mere 10 feet away from crawling through the patch of grass where Tobirama had shamefully relieved himself a while back, unwilling to give up such a good position just to go find a bathroom. With such a perfect opportunity presenting itself like this, Tobirama just couldn't resist. It would reveal his location, and he would need to find somewhere else to snipe from, but the chance to shoot Madara right in the ass from just a few feet above when he clearly thought he was safe and being sneaky. It was too good to pass up. He was just a man, no one could reasonably expect him to resist poking another hole in Madara's massive ego. Sighting down the scope was unnecessary, but it did give him a rather nice view of that delicious rump from very close. Tobirama lied openly for a moment just because he had the chance to before pulling the trigger and drinking in the sound of Madara's enraged screams like a fine wine. What the fuck? What the fuck? Below him on the ground Madara was rolling in the dirt, and Tobirama nearly dropped his jaw right off his face as he watched the idiot shove a hand down the back of his pants to rub at the sore flesh. Thoughts of free peep shows danced in his head like sugar plums at Christmas. He was considering watching through his scope again when Madara retracted his hand and it caught on the edge of his shirt, pulling it up to expose the skin of his lower back. Tobirama very much hoped no one was looking this way to see him lose his balance and fall completely out of the tree with a dismayed shriek. A very manly one, of course. Both of them grunted in pain when he landed on top of Madara. It took a second or two to get his breath back and convince his body to slowly roll to one side, groaning like a couple of old men with sore joints. Tobirama lay on his back and stared up at the sky with images of the mark he'd just seen on Madara's plane in front of his eyes, rendering him dumb and leaving him stupidly defenseless against the other man's revenge. His groan was one of pain this time when Madara's elbow dropped into his stomach. "You shot me in the ass," he was screeching. Tobirama's brain officially shorted out. "It's a nice ass." The words were out of his mouth and the screeching in his ear increased in volume before the thought even caught up to him. "So stare, don't shoot." Madara moved as though to elbow him again, this time in the throat, when he froze in place and twitched violently. "Wait, back up, you think I have a nice ass?" "We are fucking soulmates, holy shit," Tobirama blurted. The entire field fell silent. Or, that was what it felt like. In the distance he could still hear a muted yell as someone else went down to a barrage of paint and what sounded like a triumphant war cry. Here in their little circle of flattened down grass and weeds, the two of them were choking on the words he hadn't meant to say. Tobirama was giving some serious thought to emptying his entire batch of paint against himself and hightailing it the fuck out of there when Madara took that option away from him rather rudely by flipping over to pin him down. "Repeat that," he whispered in a flat voice. Tobirama prayed for his own continued sanity. "I saw your mark, the one on your lower back. It's the same as mine." Maybe if he closed his eyes he could pretend his voice wasn't shaking with nerves. This way when his doom was visited upon him he at least wouldn't have to watch death coming. He was startled into opening them again when, instead of death, Madara attacked him with kisses. Rough, demanding kisses that dragged a noise out of his throat that he could think of no words to describe, and fingers in his hair, too tight and so good. It only took a few seconds for him to cast off his surprise and respond in kind. Disappointment ripped through him when Madara pulled away. Tobirama glared to make his opinion on that very clear, but his companion only chuckled and swatted at his arm insistently. "Go on, prove it," he said. Tobirama glared harder. "What are you of a child?" Still, he did shimmy around enough so he could lift the back of his shirt and show Madara the identical mark printed just below one of his kidneys. A shiver racked him when he felt gloved fingers tracing the area, not even caring that it was probably smearing paint all over his skin. "So it's true. We are soulmates." The wonder in Madara's voice made him preen until he screamed at the sudden wave of pain in his ass accompanied by the all-too-familiar sound of gunfire. "Madara, what the fuck? Payback's a bitch." By the time he rolled back over, Madara was on his feet with his paintball gun in both hands, a wild grin on his lips. "Winner gets to be on top when I blow your mind tonight." As soon as the words were out of his mouth he was spinning around and taking off across the field with a whoop. Tobirama scrambled to his feet and fumbled for his own gun, returning to battle with his heart racing out of control. For pride's sake he would try to win, of course, but he had a feeling he was coming out on top no matter what at the end of the day. Chapter 167, Madara, Kakashi, Tobirama, the one where you see their past in their eyes. Meeting Hashirama first was a stroke of luck he would later be very grateful for. After the first few minutes of letting his excitable personality run free, Hashirama was able to calm down and have an adult conversation with him about where he was, when he had come from, the why and the how. And when they had finished discussing all the most pressing details, it was nice to have a neutral party lend a sympathetic ear to the revelation that Kakashi would probably never make it back to his own time. He was stuck here in the past. Only once he had gathered his wits and gently pushed Hashirama away from trying to comfort him did things start getting weird. "You can be really happy here too," the man had said. "I think you'll like my brother Tobirama. He'll probably understand a lot more of what you were saying about the seals and stuff that got you stuck in the past." Kakashi just smiled politely and allowed himself to be led away, content to listen as the first Hokage chattered on about how amazing it was to know that time travel was possible. While they were on their way to meet Tobirama, they ran into Madara and stopped to listen to his complaints about something the Hyuga clan had done. Even amidst his own personal crisis, Kakashi was able to take a moment to be amused that the Uchiha-Hyuga rivalry was just the same now as it would be 100 years in the future. He'd been standing quietly to the side listening in on their conversation for several minutes before Madara thought to look over and see who the hell was following the Hokage around. The second their eyes met, Kakashi felt like the world had been ripped out from underneath him, his consciousness cast back even farther in time to witness the first steps of a tiny little baby with dark hair and a happy smile. Months and years flashed by in rapid succession as the baby grew up to become a boy and then a man, plagued with bad luck in everything he tried to do but never failing to try his best. Then suddenly he was snapped back to reality to find Madara staring back at him with wide, terrified eyes. Of all the possible reactions, the last one Kakashi expected was for Madara to turn and flee like he had all the demons of hell nipping at his heels. He and Hashirama stood and watched with their jaws hanging loose until Madara was out of sight, disappearing into the bustling crowds of the marketplace. What was his problem? Hashirama asked. Kakashi couldn't make himself answer that. "Let's go meet your brother," he muttered instead. Meeting Tobirama was a much more calm experience, though no less jarring in the moment their eyes met and he once again was taken through another man's life, reeling under the sensation of taking so much information in at once. His only warning was the flash of Madara's memories, having already lived the moment the two of them discovered they were soulmates. Kakashi had only known one other set of triple soulmates in his life, though the phenomenon had occurred many times worldwide. He never would have expected that he might be a part of that himself. Having two soulmates was a hard thing to get used to when one of those soulmates avoided him for the first few days. Tobirama was at least round to commiserate that with him once they finally broke the subject. "We still haven't quite learned how to get along very well. He tries, but I think Madara feels there is something missing between us." He shrugged as though being told he was lacking by his own soulmate did not hurt, but Kakashi was able to see the stiffness in the way he held himself. Even if they weren't connected, he would have sympathized with that. "Maybe it was me that was missing," he suggested hesitantly. It was a little beyond his comprehension that he could be the glue for any social combination, but it was an idea to spring off from to find the real solution. He was surprised to see Tobirama straighten slowly, face lighting up with a look of discovery. "Yes. Maybe it was. Come with me." Kakashi had no time to protest as his wrist was grabbed and Tobirama reached out for one of his many Horatian markers, taking them to a spot only a street away from where Madara's chakra was boiling restlessly. He'd been doing the same for days. Ever since Kakashi and he met for the first time, Madara had been secluded in his home and Tobirama had mentioned he could feel the dark edges of his signature, almost like he was moping. Although what he could be moping about was a mystery. When they knocked on the door there was no answer, but Tobirama seemed to have been expecting that. He kicked the door in without so much as a change of expression and ushered Kakashi ahead of him in the direction of Madara's offended squawking. "Did you get dropped on your head as a child?" Madara demanded when they found him in his bedroom, cocooned in several blankets with an entire cupboard's worth of dirty teacups covering both nightstands on either side of the bed. "What is wrong with you? Who just barges into people's homes like this?" "I do," Tobirama told him coolly. "Get out." "No. You've had your sulk, but it's time to be an adult again and face whatever your problem is. You are aware that Kakashi is also soulmate to both of us." Why do you refuse to face him? Tobirama lifted one eyebrow in judgment. You refuse to bond with me, and yet you've never hidden from me like you do him. Struggling and failing with his blankets, Madara harumphed. Oh, don't act as if you wanted to bond with me. Well, now you have him and he is you, and the two of you can be as happy together as you like without me. Now go away. Oh, I see. All signs of irritation drained away to leave Tobirama's expression one of astonished sadness. You see nothing. I do. Don't. You were worried you would be rejected and left out. When Madara froze at his words, Tobirama sighed. Fool. Why would all three of us be matched if all three of us were not meant to play equal parts in the relationship? Madara gave up on his blankets and hunkered down with a pout. We are not in a relationship, he snapped. We could be, Kakashi piped up finally. Both of their heads swung around to look at him, and he rubbed at the back of his head awkwardly under their scrutiny. I'm just saying. You never know unless you try. Indeed. Tobirama quoted a half-smile at him in approval. Suspicious gaze flipping back and forth between the two of them, Madara gave himself a long time to think before eventually he sighed and rolled his eyes. His arms crossed even tighter around his body protectively, but the tension in his shoulders ever so slowly drained away with surrender. Fine, he grumbled. Excellent. Kakashi offered him a cheerful smile with his one exposed eye, turned around, and flopped backwards onto the end of the bed. Ah, a fine idea. He's trapped and can't get away from us. Tobirama carefully settled midway down the mattress and draped himself over the two lumps where Madara's toes were hidden under the blankets. Madara himself grumbled and squirmed, yet they both noticed a distinct lack of any attempts to remove them from their positions. It was awkward at first, although none of them were surprised by that. It took a while for them to convince Madara he needed to participate in the conversations more than just to grumble about his toes being squished. But once they did and he finally relaxed enough to allow himself to take those first steps, it was the strangest sort of magic. The way they all interacted, the way their personalities played against each other, it was like they all had one part of a bigger whole coming together to make a perfect balance that complemented all three of them. It was harmony and peace, and everything soulmates should be as long as they weren't arguing. Kakashi watched Tobirama tucking the blankets in tighter and sniggering when Madara could no longer use his arms. He smiled softly to himself as he listened to their good-natured bickering, a lifelong habit they would probably never break, and decided he was grateful to be stuck 100 years before his own time. Before he had cursed his own fate, but now he was thankful. He had everything he could have ever wanted right here in the last place he ever expected to find it. Chapter 168, Tobirama Azuna, the one where an astrological event reveals your soulmate. Sweat dripped from his temple as Tobirama ducked beneath the blade, aiming for his neck, and drove his shoulder into the body before him, knocking Azuna back enough that he had room to stand again. They stared each other down as they both adjusted their grips and rushed in once more, swords meeting in a shower of sparks that shone brilliantly in the unnatural darkness around them. Noon had only just passed, and yet the sky was black above them, the first portent of an incredible rare phenomenon Tobirama hadn't seen since he was a child. He would have much preferred to experience it from somewhere safe instead of here on the battlefield, but life had taught him the lesson long ago that he couldn't always have whatever he wanted. Disappointment was ruthlessly shoved away as so much useless distraction, and Tobirama refocused on twisting aside from Azuna's parry and flickering his fingers through the seals for a water dragon. The river rose up behind him to rear over his head and crash back down in front. He could see Azuna running through the seals for a grand fireball at the same time and smirked, allowing the expression to widen into a grin when their jutsu met and exploded into massive clouds of stain. Not even the Sharingan could see perfectly like this, although it did give his opponent an advantage, but he knew how to work around that. Sliding into the cover Azuna had oh so politely provided for him, Tobirama had several kunai between his fingers in the blink of an eye, ready to throw and finally implement the jutsu he had been perfecting for just this moment. He was stopped before the first kunai could fly when something flashed across the sky above them and his chest exploded into a brilliant cable of light. Everyone present would currently be experiencing the same thing, and the silence that fell, the utter lack of movement as they all bore witness to such an event, was the only thing that allowed Tobirama a moment to look down and admire the brilliance exuding from right over where his heart would sit. If he were to follow the light for long enough, he would find his soulmate at the other end, their souls chosen by fate to bond together, and he wished with all his heart that he could be one of the rare few who found his intended pair. Unfortunately, barely a handful of people found each other each generation. It was hard enough to predict when the astrological event would pass by them again in 5 years, 10 years, or even more, but the chances of being close enough to your soulmate to find them before the lights faded was so low that many chose to never chase such an impossible dream. Tobirama was admiring the shifting multicolored bane and considering shoving his hand into the middle of it just to see what would happen when a sudden change in the wind blew away the steam he'd been taking cover in. And he found the end of his light, the soulmate that fate had chosen for him. Izuna stared back with just as much disbelief as Tobirama was sure must be on his own face right at that moment. No matter how many chances he was given, he would never have guessed Izuna to be the soulmate he had always been waiting to discover, and without the steam there to hide them both, the rest of the world was free to share in their unexpected discovery. "Brother, I'm so happy for you." Hashirama was there suddenly, fluttering excitedly at his side, but Tobirama found he could not break the gaze between himself and Izuna, watching the way the many hues of color shifted against the pale skin of his almost cherubic face. "Over my dead body." Madara landed next to his own brother, snapping one arm out in front of him protectively and glaring heatedly at both of the Senju. "I will kill you if you touch him." "Madara, how could you say that? They are soulmates, isn't that incredible?" "No. Get your filthy brother away from mine." The siblings immediately fell to bickering while Izuna and Tobirama remained perfectly still. It was hard to process just the fact that they had beaten the astronomical odds to find their soulmate. Wrapping their heads around who they had been led to was a whole other task. With his eyes fixed so intently on the man, Tobirama saw the moment he began to move, unnoticed by Madara at first until he was several steps away and lifting one arm to reach out for Tobirama. Madara nearly strangled himself on a choked protest, but Izuna ignored him and kept walking forward while Hashirama leapt to intercept his best friend and cry sonnets about star-crossed lovers. If anything, Tobirama was sort of expecting a slap. Considering their violent history, he couldn't say why he was going with such a mild prediction, but it left him equally surprised to be pulled down by the collar so Izuna could meet him eye to eye. At first they did nothing more than continue to stare at each other from this new angle. Then finally Izuna hummed thoughtfully and loosened his grip enough that Tobirama was able to straighten his back, though not enough to escape the clinging grasp of those strong hands. "You let me get that close without trying to kill me," Izuna mumbled. "And I guess you're not entirely horrible to look at." "I'll think about it." "What dash?" Tobirama felt nothing but confusion as he was suddenly released. He remained absolutely still while the other man stepped back to take a fistful Madara's sleeve and drag his sibling away from the Senju he was still tussling with. "Come on, Aniki. If you make my favorite for lunch, I'll let you try to convince me peace is a good idea. I'll even listen this time. No promises about anything else, though." It was beyond strange to see Hashirama-level enthusiasm on Madara's face, even stranger to see him cry really and scoop his brother up for a tight hug. Izuna squirmed and shoved him off, marching away with a disgusted look on his face while Madara trailed after him, already waxing poetic about the plans he had once dreamed of for building a village. "What just happened?" Tobirama asked faintly, tossing the question out to the world at large. As he should have known the man would, Hashirama immediately began echoing Madara's speech to laud the benefits of making peace between their clans. He sprinkled in copious amounts of predictions for a happy soulmate bond, although Tobirama still wasn't entirely convinced on that. He was still mostly just happy that Izuna hadn't tried to run a sword through him for daring to be on the other end of that beam of light. Which had faded, he noticed. When had it faded? Probably sometime while he was distracted staring back into Izuna's eyes. They were surprisingly pretty from that close-up. The darkness in the sky was already beginning to lift as the event drew to an end, thin rays of sunlight breaking through to light Izuna's path back towards Uchiha territory, the first time he had ever fled from a battle without giving his best effort to kill whoever was stupid enough to stand against him. Tobirama stared until their entire clan had drifted back into the forest out of sight. Then he grunted when Hashirama tossed an arm around his shoulders and squeezed much too tightly. "Isn't this amazing?" his brother asked. "Well," Tobirama murmured, his eyes still watching the trees. "We'll see. It'll be interesting, if nothing else." Chapter 169, Tobarama Kagami, the one where only one of you knows. He had known the very moment they met, of course. At the time, Kagami had been terrified of the very prospect, hiding behind his art so the scary Senju wouldn't see him there in the crowd of Uchiha, forgetting for a second that if he knew it meant that the other would not. Kagami recognized Tobarama as his soulmate when he was nothing but a terrified child raised on nighttime stories of the demon with red eyes that would gobble him up if he strayed out of bed at night. Tobarama looked past him like he was just another face in the crowd, unaware of the secret born right under his nose. Naturally inquisitive and more brave than was good for someone as untrained as him, it didn't take long before Kagami was seeking out the Senju heir to see if he was really as bad as the bedtime stories had led him to believe. He couldn't be all that terrible if he was living here in the village that Madara-sama had built so they could all stay safe. It took several sessions of spying on the man as he trained a handful of other young people Kagami's age before Tobarama gave in and called out for him to join them. Apparently he had known Kagami was there the whole time but was waiting to see if he would show his face on his own. Before he realized that he found himself with a teen, a teacher, and between 1 week and the next he was spending several hours every day learning the shinobi arts from his own soulmate, one of the strongest fighters in any of the many clans now living here in Konoha. Kagami could have mentioned it after that. He wasn't blind, he knew Tobarama had developed a soft spot for him much quicker than the others, although that might have just been because he had perfected the puppy-eyed look and had no shame in chasing the man for a bit of extra attention. But he also wasn't stupid and he knew it might be a little hard for the man to believe that someone 8 years younger was meant to be his soulmate. Now might not be the best time to reveal his secret. Kagami held his silence, determined to wait, and did his best to ignore that soft feeling growing behind his ribs. As a teenager he graduated from Genin the Chin. As a young adult he was promoted from Chin to Genin. And throughout it all Kagami waited for the right time to confess his secret to the man who didn't know they were soulmates. One would think his biggest worry would be any possible anger over the fact that he had stayed quiet for so long. But it wasn't. Kagami's biggest worry was his fear of the feelings growing inside him. Every year that passed he fell more and more in love while also growing less and less certain that Tobarama would accept such things from him. Not all bonds between soul pairs were meant to be romantic, after all. It wasn't a guarantee that his soulmate would have any sort of romantic feelings for him, but after waiting for this long in silence Kagami wasn't sure what rejection might do to his poor heart. In the end he confessing by accident, midway through his 20s, and so in love it choked him sometimes when he gave it too much thought. They weren't doing much at the time, just taking a calm meal by the fire together, sent out on some forgettable mission that he would later forget all details about except for this night. He'd been thrilled to get paired with his old team captain again, and then doubly thrilled that it was only the two of them. Every moment they spent together was precious to him, but it was more so when he could have the man all to himself. "Why were you so eager to get away from home?" he asked, idly pitching the bones from his dinner into the coals by their feet. "This mission is hardly anything of your caliber, so you must have volunteered." "It's hardly worthy of your skills either," Tobarama pointed out. "Flatterer. HN." Kagami grinned. "So go on then. Did you just miss little old me?" "I will admit that seeing your name on the roster made the choice of which mission to sign on for a lot easier. Mostly I just needed to get away from Hashirama, he's been insufferable lately." "More than usual?" Tobarama snorted and Kagami triumphed for having made him laugh. "Yes, more than usual," the man explained. "For whatever reason he's gotten it into his head to bother me about looking harder to find my soulmate. As though it's guaranteed that I will be the one who knows when I see them. If I had to listen to the same drivel over dinner one more time I was going to strangle him." "Oh." Kagami bit his lip and looked away. "Even worse, he's gotten into my head now. I find myself thinking about it even when he isn't around, and Kami help me, I'm going to kill him, but he's got me curious about others." Tobarama turned to consider him and Kagami froze like a rabbit spotted by a wolf. "Like you, for example. I've never heard anything about soulmates from you." "Me? Ha ha ha, no, I'm fine." That wasn't an answer at all. Hashirama would have a field day with that non-answer. Tobarama quirked an eyebrow, probably to say that he didn't approve either. Nervous, Kagami swallowed and spoke without thinking. "I am, really. I'm happy even if they don't know." He winced as Tobarama turned to face him fully. You know who they are and you haven't told them, he asked, incredulous. Don't you think they would want to know? Stalling, he blurted, well, would you want someone you've known for years to confess they are in love with you? What if you don't feel the same? I don't want to ruin what we have now. What? Why are you looking at me like that? Oh, nothing. It's silly. Tobirama forced a light chuckle and waved him off. It was just the way you worded that. It sounded as though you were implying that I myself am your soulmate. Did it? Kagami squeaked. He knew he was doomed when Tobirama looked at him closely again, knew his cheeks would be the color of shame and his eyes as wide as shuriken. For maybe half a second he considered fleeing for the sake of his continued sanity, but it really wasn't worth the effort. Tobirama would catch him before he could get out of the clearing they had turned into a campsite. Which left him only with the option of facing the music, not his favorite option, but at least he would finally get everything over with and find out his fate at last. Also, the due in highlights look the other man was giving him was at least sort of worth it for entertainment value alone. Kagami, am I your soulmate? Tobirama asked him in a shaken voice. Maybe. So you are in love with me? Well. You see, Kagami trailed off, racking his brain for some way to salvage the ruins of their friendship now that everything was out in the open, because clearly Tobirama was about to hate him. His brain got about as far as, well, nothing. There was absolutely nothing in his head. Kagami was great with battlefield panic, but personal matters usually left him with an empty head and a broken vocabulary, exhibited rather nicely right then as Tobirama reached for him, and instead of dodging the blow, all he could do was gobble out a few disconnected syllables. As it turned out, however, Tobirama did not strike him. Tobirama cupped his cheek and tilted his face up to bestow him with the single most amazing kiss he had ever experienced in his life. It was also his first kiss, but that was just extra details. Even without prior experience, Kagami was pretty sure Tobirama was the most amazing kisser in all of Fire Country. His knees were weak, his heart was hammering, and his blood didn't know if it wanted to rush up or down. When they pulled apart, he whined, chasing the other man for more without a thought for how pathetic it might make him look. He was too focused on all of his dreams coming true and trying to make this moment last forever. Kagami, Tobirama murmured, his lowered voice a rumbling caress. You and I are going to have words later about why you never thought to inform me of this. I didn't think you would like me like I like you. You'd what? The dazed expression they were both wearing slipped away for Tobirama to frown down at him while Kagami squirmed. Embarrassed, he rubbed at the back of his head. Nothing. We don't have to talk about it. I believe we do. Later, though. Tobirama gave him a stern look to make sure Kagami understood that the conversation they needed to have was non-optional. Then he nodded once to himself and leaned back down to dig Kagami almost entirely off the log they were using for a seat, ending the conversation with another mind-bending kiss. All things considered, despite the pain and the anxiety of biding his time, despite the mortification he would surely suffer later when they finally had that discussion, Kagami thought this moment right here was entirely worth it all. Chapter 170, Tobirama or Ruka, the one where you gain a mark only after you get to know each other. Were he given a choice beforehand, Ruka was pretty sure he would have declined the opportunity and insisted that he very much did not belong in the past, that he was too used to the conveniences of the future. It wasn't until he was thrown back there in an accident involving a child plane with an unknown seal that he was forced to realize he was much more of an old soul than he had ever been willing to admit. Being stuck in the past was kind of worth it just for the not yet filthy onsens and the beautiful unadulterated landscapes still unsettled. Of course, those weren't the only advantages. There were also dozens of young minds in a fresh new academy with a curricular system that still needed cementing. As soon as the Shodaime Hokage vetted his story that he was from the future, he was sent straight to Senju Tobirama, the very one who had invented the academy, his own personal hero, and was told he would be working with the man closely to determine what had worked about the way it was in the future and how it could be improved. Actually working alongside Tobirama was about as close to a dream come true as Aruka had ever experienced. While he certainly could not be described as the warmest person ever, Tobirama embodied all of the qualities Aruka most enjoyed in a partner of any sort: pragmatic, intelligent, punctual, and surprisingly fond of children under that tough exterior. His tendency to overlook the limits of a normal and trained child under the age of 10 was well balanced out by Ruka's own habit of coddling them past the age when he should be stepping back to let them make their own mistakes. It was a partnership they both learned from. More than that, it became a partnership that grew into a friendship. Even after they had hammered out the academy curriculum in its final form, they still continued to meet for lunch occasionally and took long walks together after work on a frequent basis. Naruto listened with a sympathetic ear to whatever stupidity the other man was suffering through at the hands of the admin staff, and Tobirama listened with a barely there smile as Aruka gushed about his students, the new prospective ones and the old ones he would miss from the future. Several months went by before he managed to stop himself from trembling with anticipation every morning just for getting to work in close quarters with such a venerated man, but once they were able to treat each other as nothing more than fellow human beings, they got along famously. And then came the day when Aruka woke one morning to find a new mark over the skin of his right pectoral, a mark that had never been there before but he recognized immediately. It resembled a pool of water upon which floated a single leaf. Aruka spent 10 minutes admiring it before it truly hit him what this meant. He had met his soulmate. They had met and spent time together, and the universe had judged them a good enough match to reveal the connection to them. There were very few people the mark had enough potential to be meant for. Since being thrown back in time, he hadn't made a lot of close friends and spent significant amounts of time with even fewer. Most of his free time he chose to spend with Tobirama, and while he absolutely would be thrilled to be matched to the man, Aruka didn't want to get his hopes up too much. What were the chances he would be matched to his own personal hero? What were the chances he would be lucky enough to match with the person he had slowly developed a crush on over the past few months? He had trouble believing someone like him could be Tobirama's type. He found himself nervous when they met for lunch that day, almost more nervous than when they had first met, and he'd felt like he was speaking to a minor deity. Tobirama seemed more quiet than usual as well, oddly enough, so conversation wasn't exactly flowing while they both sipped at their ramen broth, heads up in the clouds. "Did you leave anyone behind when you left your proper time?" Tobirama kept his eyes on his meal when he spoke. Aruka scoffed. "Well, I had a lot of students. I'm sure they miss me." "No partner? No soulmate?" Funny you should mention soulmates, actually." Aruka laughed nervously when Tobirama shot him a curious look. "Before I left, I never found my soulmate in the future, but just this morning I woke up and there it was, my soul mark. I just thought you might find it interesting, the implications that perhaps I was always meant to come back to the past, or maybe the implications that some people never find their soulmate because they never had a chance, not being born at the right time. Either one is sort of terrifying to think about, you know. A set time loop or an uncaring universe that separates pairs so carelessly." When he realized he was rambling, Aruka cut himself off with a sheepish smile and returned to his noodles, embarrassed in the long silence that followed. Spending so much time with this man had expanded his intellectual horizons and given him a chance to study more than just what his students might be able to comprehend. Unfortunately, it had the side effect of making his rambling habits so much worse. "You found your mark today?" Tobirama asked finally. "Just this morning. For the first time. On my chest. It's really pretty, actually." "I see. Does it, perchance, look anything like this one that I, too, found only this morning?" Tobirama waited until Aruka jerked his head up with shock before carefully pulling his shirt to one side. It was indeed the same mark. Later, Aruka would be mortified that the only thing he could think of to say was, "Holy crap." That's poor language for a shaper of your minds, sensei." Tobirama was smiling, that special tiny smile more genuine than any other expression he ever made. Sorry. I don't know what to say." He couldn't seem to take his eyes off that small patch of pale chest, either. "You could say 7 o'clock, perhaps." "Wait, what?" Tobirama settled his clothing back into place, much to Aruka's disappointment. "I need to return to work soon, but I should like to pick you up for dinner at 7 if you are willing." "Like a date?" "Yes. Like a date." He was smiling a little bigger now, almost unheard of. Aruka's poor heart was nearly fluttering out of his chest, but he managed not to fall off his stool or anything else that would make him look even more ridiculous than usual. "It's art, sure." "Yeah. 7 o'clock it is." Staring at the man with what was probably a very foolish expression, Iruka thought that if he ever found the ancestor of the child that sent him back in time, he might have to give them something to hold on to until that boy was born, a gift of thanks for something he hadn't even done yet. It was just an accident, but it given him everything. Chapter 171, Hashirama Madara, the one where you suffer Hanahaki if they don't love you back. It was a hard thing in general for Hashirama to hide things. He was an open person in all respects, believed that trust was built on honesty and sharing, and lying to his loved ones had always made him uncomfortable. Considering that, it wasn't all that surprising that hiding the fact that he was dying lasted for all of a couple days. Tobirama found him sitting in the bath, the water long gone cold, and the surface dusted with blue petals. His brother stood in the doorway with a raised eyebrow and a cocked hip, irritated over how long he'd been denied his own cirque. Setting a romantic mood for yourself, he asked with sarcasm dripping from every syllable. Hashirama opened his mouth to answer but choked on several more petals instead. Anija. The man was at his side in an instant, patting his back until his airways were clear and several more forget-me-nots laddered the bathwater. I'm not really surprised, Hashirama whispered. If he were honest, he'd been waiting for this for a while now. Let's get you warmed up, this water is ice cold. Tobirama helped him out of the tub and coached him into covering himself, then marched him to his bedroom where he was swaddled in at least 3 blankets. Neither of them said anything as he puttered around the room, opening the curtains, pulling a few potted plants a bit closer, then settling at the far end of the mattress as though sitting too close might hurt the one curled up at the head of the bed. You had to know it would happen too, Hashirama muttered with a sad smile. His brother snarled. I'll kill him. No. Absolutely not. It isn't his fault he doesn't feel the same, Toby. He shook his head and patted the mattress until his brother cautiously moved up to settle down at his side and let him rest his head on a broad shoulder. He's your soulmate, Tobirama protested quietly. He should love you. As much as he wanted to agree, Hashirama did not have the energy to point out how wrong that statement was. From the moment they met he had been sure they were soulmates, destined for greatness of all sorts so long as they stayed by each other's side. Even when they had been torn apart by their families, he never stopped believing that someday they would come together again and accomplish everything their hearts had ever dreamed of. It was that belief which gave him the strength to reach out his hand again and again, no matter how many times he was pushed away. And now here they were with all their dreams realized around them, and Hashirama could hardly breathe around the gardenias in his throat. He had waited, given space, hinted and implied anything and everything that he could think of. For all his efforts, Madara had never once indicated that he felt at all the same, that he too might lie awake at night and wonder what it would be like to be one. The petals were a bittersweet confirmation that he had been right, at least. Madara was the only man he loved. To have that love go unfulfilled and find himself laid low with the fabled Hanahaka disease could only mean that they truly were soulmates. Hashirama let his sibling fuss over him, shamelessly enjoying being on the opposite end of this for once, until Tobirama had worked himself up into such a tither that he leapt up and stormed out of the house spouting something incomprehensible about fixing everything himself. It wasn't very clear what he thought he could do to make the situation better, but Hashirama was honestly just touched that he cared enough to try. Spending time in bed in the middle of the day felt strange, though very relaxing minus the terrible bouts of coughing, of course. If it weren't for the garbage pail slowly filling up with blooded flowers, he might have said he enjoyed himself. Once it struck, the symptoms of Hanahaki tended to progress quite fast, so he might as well relax while he could. Legend said that soulmates had not existed once, that Hanahaki had run rapid through a population with no guidance towards their proper mates, and that many had died from yearning for ones they weren't even meant to have. Hashirama felt he could sympathize since he was about to perish from yearning for even the one he was supposed to have. The fates had done what they could, but there was simply no forcing some people to see the perfection that was right in front of them. He was wondering if he could get away with taking a whole nap before anyone noticed he hadn't returned to the office when the front door slammed open and 2 very familiar bickering voices drifted down the hall. Fear gripped him immediately, followed by betrayal. What on earth was Tobirama thinking that led him to go get Madara? Clearly Hashirama didn't want the others seeing him like this. Not that he was given any choice at all in the matter, not even a cursory had popped around the doorframe to ask if this was okay. Instead, the 2 of them barged into his bedroom, and Hashirama winced at the way Madara fell utterly silent at first sight of him. Brother, he rasped, I'm going to haunt you from the grave for this. Incorrect. You are going to thank me. Tobirama rolled his eyes and clapped Madara on the back so hard he stumbled forward. Then he ducked out of the room to afford them some unwanted privacy. Madara regained his feet within arm's length of the bed and went right back to staring. Fidgeting restlessly, Hashirama looked away and back several times before settling his gaze on the flowers in his lap. His fingers pulled restlessly at the flowers until he cursed his luck and doubled over for yet another coughing fit. White petals stuck to his lips and he was forced to claw them out from the back of his throat before he could take in a significant amount of Eragan. Madara thumped him awkwardly on the back and jabbered out meaningless encouragement while he was fighting for breath. He collapsed onto the mattress at his sick friend's side as soon as the rush of panic was over. Hashirama was sipping at a glass of water to soothe his throat when Madara plucked one of the flowers from his lap and twirled it, his brows furrowed so deep he looked almost angered by what he saw. Lotus blossoms. Far from the one he loves. I didn't know you felt that way about someone outside the village. The way he held himself was incredibly stiff. Hashirama sighed. Leave it to this man to not even notice that someone is desperately in love with him. I don't think it's meant literally. Just emotionally. Emotionally far from. Sounds like hokum to me, but whatever. Who are you emotionally far from, then? He spoke as though every word offended him, though Hashirama couldn't figure out why. Tired and sore and figuring he might as well get it over with now, Hashirama sighed and reached out to tuck one of his forget-me-nots behind Madara's ear, securing it in the waterfall of ink black hair that he had always dreamed of burying his fingers in. Would it be silky? Scratchy? Would Madara have let him brush it out for him at night? Useless questions, but he had spent hours pondering them when he couldn't sleep for the wanting. You, he murmured simply. Madara stared at him again and Hashirama realized he would have to explain. I understand that you don't feel the same, my good friend, but I have loved you since the day we met. Loved? It's all right that you don't too. Really it is. But Madara cut himself off with a frown and looked down at the flower in his hand again. If you love me, then why is this happening to you? I don't understand. Do I really have to explain? I'm no good at explaining things, you know that. And I know you know what causes Hanahaka disease. Hashirama shrugged, coughed a few times because his throat hurt. With one of his hands he traced the petals of the blossom and the other man's hands just because they were soft and he had picked one that wasn't too covered in blood to admire the color of it. He didn't really understand what was so confusing about this, but he knew Madara had always needed a little more time than most to work through how he felt about something. Very likely he was trying to decide how to react to knowing someone had such feelings for him. It was sort of a miracle that he didn't just start screaming like he usually did, although Hashirama was sort of grateful for that. He was going to be rejected either way, but sitting on his deathbed felt like a good place to finally have a little caution between them. Neither one of them was the type to be cautious, normally. Madara threw himself at the world like he was determined to bring the whole thing to its knees, and Hashirama had too much enthusiasm and every emotion to bother with feathering himself. Love was the only thing he had ever held back, but only because it was so clearly not returned. This doesn't make sense, Madara said after a while, frowning deeper in the way he did when he was frustrated with himself for not being able to solve a problem. What part? Hashirama asked. All of it. Hanahaki is for if your soulmate doesn't love you back. Yes, now he was frowning too, confusion growing. Madara's frown turned down into an outright scowl. But you said you're in love with me. I'm not sure what part of that doesn't make sense. Hashirama jerked in surprise when Madara threw both of his arms into the air, noting peripherally that he made certain to keep a safe grip on the lotus blossom and not harm it in any way. Well, if you love me, then shouldn't it be your soulmate dying from this shit? Madara, pausing to catch the other man's gaze first, he asked, you get that you are my soulmate, right? I'm in love with you, you don't feel the same, knowing that you don't love me back has caused me to contract a beautiful death. What is it about this that confuses you? He must be spending a bit too much time with his brother, he realized then, because that came out rather snarky. Amazingly, Madara didn't make so much as a single comment on his supposed attitude. The man was staring at him with eyes budding out of his head and features gone totally slack with shock. Hashirama wondered if he should have phrased his words a little less bluntly. I'm your soulmate. Yes. Hashirama blinked. That's the part that surprises you. How can you be dying of Hanahaki if I'm your soulmate? But it just doesn't make sense. You're the only one not making sense, my friend. Madara's frustrated growl would have been really cute if he hadn't also scrunched the fingers of his free hand into angry claws that actually managed to look quite threatening even if one ignored the crazy person vibes currently rolling off of him. When he slammed his hand into the wall behind Hashirama's head, there was enough tension in his expression to easily suggest incoming violence, not all that out of character for him and not truly an unexpected reaction. Violence was much more familiar from him than thoughtful silence. Fingers cupped themselves around the back of his head and Hashirama briefly thought about dodging the incoming headbutt. Then there was a pair of chapped lips pressed against his own, messy, passionate, the physical interpretation of nonverbal screaming, and it took a long handful of seconds before he realized he was being kissed. Madara was kissing him. His body melted into the embrace, leaning forward to take everything he could while the offer was there. Never let it be said that Hashirama was too dumb to recognize an opportunity when it was there. When they pulled apart, he wanted to say something suave or really important, but instead they both gaped at each other like fools. Why did you kiss me? He couldn't help but ask. It was everything he wanted, but Madara had shown no signs of sharing those desires in all the time they had known each other. You were dying, came the defensive answer. Because I thought you didn't love me. I didn't know that was an option. Hashirama paused. You what? He watched Madara fluster, disappointed when he retracted his hands to wave them about in search of the words to explain himself. You friendly with everyone, I didn't think I was anything special. Not like that. Oh. Oh Madara, of course you're special. You've always been so special to me in so many ways. It didn't take a mirror for him to notice the tears welling up in his eyes, but for once his best friend said nothing derogatory about how easily he was prone to crying. Clearly out of his element, Madara dapped his head to pout, trying to pass off his embarrassment as irritation the way he always did. Shut up. Of course I'm special. And I guess you're not the worst person I know. You are my soulmate, apparently. For a moment he swayed as the weight of the situation finally hit him. Or that might have been the impact of Hashirama throwing himself into the man's arms and pulling his chin up for another kiss. This is amazing, Hashirama breathed. It's so amazing. Oh Madara, I've dreamed about this. Don't be so grevy. Despite his protests, he didn't seem to be putting in much of an effort to escape the affections raining down on him like a fountain. Hashirama grinned and dapped in for another kiss, pushing his luck as much as he dared. In his luck, the petals that he had been coughing up all morning turned to ash, and inside his chest the roots that had begun to sprout were now withering away. The love that he had thought would kill him rushed through his veins and trilled with joy when he felt rough fingers cup the back of his head once more, winding into his hair and holding fast as though Madara could not bear to let him go. This, he decided, was the true meaning of a beautiful death, an ending of sorts that paved the way for a long-awaited beginning. Chapter 172, Tenzu Waruka, the one where you know them by touch. You've got to make some friends soon, Senpai told him, not loosening the grip on his wrist by even the slightest, but no matter how much he pulled. Tenzu twisted his face with disbelief for a moment until he remembered that without his mask everyone could see him. It felt like the entire village was watching even if he couldn't see anyone looking at them while they wove through the marketplace. But Senpai, you don't have any friends. I tried it and didn't like it. You have to at least try it too. Kakashi snickered and continued to pull him along against his will. They ended up at some sort of food stall which appeared to be selling ramen, run by a jolly fellow and a younger lady barely older than himself that Tenzu guessed was the old guy's daughter. He did have to admit that the smells coming out of that kitchen were absolutely divine. Someone else was already at the counter with a massive bowl of ramen, but they both ignored the boy as they settled themselves onto the two stools at the far end of the row. Tenzu let his senpai have the corner seat, more than aware of his overzealous tendencies for vigilance. He was just as happy to sit anywhere Kakashi led him. This was the first time anyone had ever invited him out to eat a meal together, and he was determined not to mess it up somehow by tripping over some unknown social rule. If all Senpai wanted was to sit in the corner, then that was an easy concession to make. Ramen, as it turned out, was the most delicious food on the entire planet. Tenzu inhaled the scent of his breath like a fine bouquet of wine before gulping the whole thing down like cool water. It was gone in barely more time than it took his companion to do the same, an accomplishment considering how fast Kakashi ate most of the time. Apparently he must have impressed the other boy sitting down at the far end as well. Tenzu watched from the corner of his eye as the boy wriggled in his seat for a moment before hopping several stools over, one by one. "You must really like ramen," he said. Tenzu smiled genially. "It's my first time having it. It's really good." "What? You've never had ramen before?" The boy looked almost like Tenzo had insulted his religion, ponytail bristling and the scar across his nose turning white with shock. "No, I've never had the chance before." His admission sent the boy reeling sideways, hands pressed against the side of his face with his mouth open in a perfect round O. The way he hopped over just one more stool closer made his hair bob cutely, but it was the open grin that caught Tenzo's attention and the way he didn't seem at all afraid of the two older teens in A and B armor. "That's just crazy," the boy said. "Ramen is amazing and everyone should get to try it. Ma, Iruka-chan, teacher should pay you to advertise for hen." Kakashi, leaning over to wink slowly at the boy, apparently named Iruka, who huffed and blew a raspberry. Tenzu shooed his senpai away. "You come here a lot then, I take it?" "Oh yeah. I save up the money old man Hokage gives me for groceries, so I have enough to come here every week." Iruka beamed, proud of himself for saving money, or maybe just proud that he had a personal connection of some sort to the Hokage. Tenzo wondered why Sarutobi-sama was giving money to a young boy so frequently, but he refrained from asking. He might not be the most socially literate, but even he understood that would probably be rude. Speaking of being rude, he appeared to have forgotten another social convention, something not allowed en route because of the dangers that came with potential attachments. "My apologies, I should introduce myself. I'm Tenzo." He held out one hand to shake. "Iruka. Nice to meet you." The other boy held out his hand as well and took hold of Tenzu's. The moment their skin touched, it was like a magnet deep down inside of him, drawing him and towards the one he was now clinging to for dear life. While Kakashi ordered another bowl of noodles, completely unsuspecting of what was happening right next to him, Tenzu and Iruka stared into each other's eyes with a deep awe. If Tenzu were honest, he had wondered if he might not even have a soulmate. He had worried sometimes when he had no company but his own dark thoughts if the training all root agents undergo might have suppressed his true self too much to truly connect with anyone else in this manner. He was unspeakably pleased to be proven wrong, though. "Well," he whispered, unable to think of the proper way to express himself at that moment. Iruka gripped his hand tighter and leaning in. Tenzo leaned in too, not wanting to miss a single word. I have a little apartment to myself. Do you want to come over? We could hang out for a while and stuff. If you want." "Yes. I mean yes please, I would like that." Without letting go of Iruka's hand, he slid off his stool, blindly rooting around in his pocket for some money. "Here you go, senpai. Thanks for inviting me, but I really have to go now." They were smiling at each other and fumbling their steps while they walked, eager to gush together over how happy they were, so wrapped up in each other that neither of them noticed Kakashi looking up from his second bowl of ramen to jerk his head around and look around himself, entirely confused to find himself suddenly alone. "Kohai? What just happened?" Already turning the corner, Tenzu didn't even hear him. "Hey, old man teacher, did you see a little short squirt? Brown hair. Big eyes. I could have sworn he was right here." Chapter 173, Madara Sakura, the one where you feel their emotions when arguing, Haruna. As angry as he was, Madara took shameless pleasure from the way every idiot in this stupid hospital leapt out of his path as he stormed along the two-lane hallway. He could admit privately that he always poured just a little more of himself into his anger if it was Sakura he was fighting with. Suck on it, Uchiha. Maybe it was because even after all this time he still couldn't help but lend an ear to the small disappointed voice in the back of his head that noted a lack of anything else when they argued, a massive echoing emptiness where he longed to feel some other emotion than his own. Sakura had been the first person he could actually see himself bonding with, but he had proven that to be a dead end within the first 5 minutes of knowing each other. "You do use such foul language against me." Slamming into the room where that unholy shriek was coming from, Madara narrowed his eyes at the deceptively pixie-like figure standing within, green eyes burning hot over the top of her clipboard. If she wanted to, she could wield that thin piece of wood like a deadly weapon. He hoped to have a front row seat if she ever decided to. Sakura was scary, but it was an impressive sort of scary that he was embarrassingly into it. If I'd known your senses were so delicate, I would have taken up swearing a long time ago, Sakura hissed at him. Her patient cowered under their sheets. Never mind the language, you dare try to subvert my own clan members against me. He wished he could say he'd never been so angry in his life, but he knew deep down she hadn't actually meant any harm, and he had suffered much more grievous insults during the warring era when it was every clan for themselves. That didn't stop him from thinking she was being incredibly unreasonable and stubborn. He was still angry, even if he was capable of being much angrier. That did not take away from the seriousness of the current situation. All I did was tell them about the stupidity coming in their future if they continue to let you run things the way you are right now. Sakura stomped over to jab him in the chest with the charts. You heard everything I told Hashirama-san. You know what I experienced in the future. Complete genocide of your entire clan. Shouldn't that sort of thing make you want to, I don't know, change how you do things in the present? How can you know that you telling me these things hasn't already changed our course? Because you're still stupid, that's how. Madara snarled his most menacing snarl, equal parts impressed and frustrated when it didn't even faze her. What you see as an outsider observing from afar is less than half of what happens out of the public eye. It isn't for you to say whether I'm running my clan properly or not. That is for them to decide themselves. He was entirely secure in his honest anger and the knowledge that she was wrong and he right, until she threw one last curveball at him that he did not expect, though he really should have, considering where this argument was going. As if you even care what they think, Sakura spat out. From what I've observed as an outsider, you don't even seem to care for your clan at all. You're completely heartless. Pain ripped through him and Madara physically stumbled back under the force of her words. He saw her gasp as well, but could not be bothered to care why. What she had said to him might not have sounded like a dire insult to someone else, but in his mind it was the worst thing anyone had ever said to him in his life. His clan was everything to him. Anyone who truly understood the Uchiha would know that family and interpersonal bonds were the most important things in their lives. Their methods of showing love might not make a lot of sense to others, but to them every move they made was carefully calculated to show their regard for those around them. Madara chose the tea he served at every clan meeting specifically with certain people in mind. He ordered new cushions when one of the elders developed an allergy to goose down. In every council meeting with the other clan heads, he fought tooth and nail for his people to have the respect they deserved, and anything else he thought they might need to be happy. For someone like Sakura, someone he had allowed to crawl under his skin and settle next to his heart, to suggest that he did not care for those around him, he could not think of anything that might hurt him more. It was terrible to discover she thought so low of him. They argued frequently, of course, but he argued with everyone. He sort of enjoyed it, actually. Or he had until now. Did I? You? Oh. Oh my God. Neither of them noticed as the clipboard went clattering to the ground, charts and medical files scattering in all directions. Sakura was too busy staring with her hands pressed over her mouth. When it finally occurred to Madara what was wrong, he found that he was just as torn as his companion looked. She seemed unable to decide whether to react with wonder that she had discovered her soulmate or with sympathy for the feelings she had clearly just hurt. He wondered himself how he could find joy in finally having what he always wanted when she had tainted it already. You will excuse me, Madara took the decision from her with his back held stiffly upright. He spun on one heel without waiting for a reply and stepped back out of the room, though he only made it halfway down the hall before he heard shoes squealing against the linoleum floors behind him. Wait. Madara, hold on. Sakura nearly crashed into him in her enthusiasm, skittering to a halt just in time and taking an iron grip on his arm. You can't just walk away. We are soulmates. He snorted, keeping his chin raised so as not to look at her. Indeed. And it appears my soulmate has an incredibly low opinion of me, so if I might have my arm back. No. Hey, come on. I'm sorry. You had no right. She jerked in surprise when he spun on her angrily. absolutely no right to assume such things about something you know nothing about. He was surprised in return when she swallowed her pride enough to nod miserably. No. You're right. I shouldn't have said that. Oh. Well, no, you shouldn't have. Loosening her grip on his arm until he might have escaped if he wanted to, she asked, I'd like to make it up to you, if I could. How about lunch tomorrow? Casual, informal, and you can tell me exactly how wrong I was to say such a horrid thing about you. HN. I do like telling people they're wrong. Just this once, she warned him with a smile slowly growing on her lips. Madara's gaze dropped down to see, but he looked away quickly when he realized he was licking his own lips. There was no need to give away his entire hand so easily. I suppose that is acceptable. Lunch it is. At 11 o'clock sharp, I will collect you from your office downstairs. Excellent, I'll be ready. Madara nodded, forcing himself to look away altogether when her smile kicked it up several notches. She was unfairly pretty, and it made him wonder if she knew that, if anyone had ever bothered to tell her just how distracting she was to poor souls like him. Perhaps if they were able to build a compatible relationship and she happened to catch him in a vulnerable moment, he might tell her. Things promised to be interesting between them, if nothing else. In all the many arguments they'd had, he thought he recognized no feelings other than his own, when in reality it was just that she was feeling the exact same emotions he was: anger, irritation, righteousness, a desire to prove the other person wrong, and yearning, apparently. The two of them were going to need to find a middle ground somewhere, something he'd never done for anyone else before. But, he thought to himself as he ducked away, she would be worth it when no one else had been. Chapter 174, Madara, Tobirama, the one where you see their past in their eyes. Everyone knew that meeting an Uchiha's eyes was dangerous. Tobirama failed to see how that was a danger to people like him who never met anyone's eyes at all. It was a marvel to him that any shinobi from one of the major clans would ever take a chance meeting the eyes of someone outside their clan and risk the possibility of finding their soulmate in the wrong place. He had decided a long time ago that he would rather never meet them than to discover his soulmate in a sworn enemy. And, of course, because that was exactly what he didn't want, that was exactly what he got. Fate was an asshole that Tobirama had been wrestling with since the day he was born, too weak and too white. Tobirama had made no secret of how little he trusted this flimsy notion of peace between his brother and Madara. No matter that it had been he himself who granted Azuna mercy when he could have taken the other's life, that didn't mean he had any faith in their willingness to stick to this alliance. The whole lot of them were glaring across the field where the Senju were gathered, clearly unhappy with the proceedings, and it would only take one upstart to send the whole lot of them back into a battle frenzy. He was so focused on keeping an eye on the main group of Uchiha that he almost forgot to watch out for the one closest to him, shaking hands with his brother. If he had been paying attention, then he wouldn't have been so startled to find the man suddenly right next to him with a scowl that set off his fight or flight instincts. As soon as he finally noticed, after the rush of shame, that he could allow himself to be so complacent to not notice the others approached, his body moved on its own and fell into a defensive stance out of mere habit. In the corner of his eyes he could see nearly everyone else present grow tense, but he had eyes only for the way Hashirama drooped with sadness and Madara frowned with a great deal of offense. "We're not monsters," he growled. Tobirama hummed but didn't bother to voice his disbelief. "Please be nice," Hashirama pleaded with him. "Isn't this a good thing? No more deaths." "You're overlooking how many clans we are still at war with," Tobirama pointed out. Making peace with one clan did not mean an end to all deaths forever. If people wanted to label him as pessimistic they could, but he preferred to think of himself as a realist who considered the details that others willfully forgot. Details like Madara rejecting the last 15 offers of peace, for example, but who was he to bring that up now? "Won't you please just try to be nice?" Hashirama asked again. "He'll get as much respect from me as he gives." That sounded like a good deal to him, especially since he didn't expect anyone from the Uchiha clan to be capable of affording him more respect than it took to spit at his feet. Their clans had been at war for hundreds of years, dozens of generations. Did his fool of a sibling expect that to just disappear because he pouted a little? Madara, however, surprised him. "I won't throw any punches if you don't," the man grumbled. "On the fan, I swear." Without generations of spies sending them information about their enemies, Tobirama wouldn't have known how meaningful that oath was to an Uchiha. He found himself a little taken aback. We'll see, he allowed. Now shake hands. Hashirama shuffled his weight back and forth like an excitable child, prompting both of them to roll their eyes at his behavior. Really, Anija? Is that necessary? Tobirama flinched when his brother turned the disappointed frown on him, the patented big brother face he used when he was upset with someone else for not acting politely according to his standards, at least. It was usually easier to just go along with whatever he wanted rather than deal with the incessant whining afterwards. Seeking only to make his own life easier, Tobirama turned to Madara and shoved a hand out towards him. Fine, he muttered petulantly. Madara harumphed and took his hand as well. You can't even look at each other. They both glared at Hashirama's continued wheedling. I don't look at anyone, Tobirama pointed out, but that hardly deterred him. Deepening the frown, Hashirama added a hint of a pout. Just this once. For me. It would make such a good example for everyone else. As much as he wanted to find an argument for that, Tobirama knew he was mostly just being childish at this point. He truly did not see this ending well, but years of experience told him that it was easier to let Hashirama make his own mistakes, even if those mistakes had the potential to cost people their lives. Hopefully it would only be Uchiha lives. Feeling nagged, if not outright coerced, he pointedly tightened the grip he had on Madara's hand and lifted his eyes. Images and memories assaulted him immediately. He found himself inundated with a lifetime of moments with a family that was not his own, and yet the memories were filled with so much love he knew he would never be able to look at Azuna the same way again. The boy in his vision grew older and sadder, suffered losses that he understood all too well, and Tobirama wished he could close his eyes to the sight of dreams slowly drawing farther and farther from reaching fingertips. He'd never really sought to understand Madara's motives before. Now he understood all too well, and he was loath to admit that he had been quite wrong about the man. They were both left reeling when it was finally over, utterly still and clinging to their linked hands as though anchoring each other to the earth. Madara parted his lips to speak. Well. Fuck me sideways. HNGG, Tobirama goggled for lack of any better way to express himself. He couldn't help but agree with the other's crass statement. I didn't, but you. Yeah, he replied faintly. That about sums it up. What? Sums what up? Hashirama and Azuna both stood a little closer, looking back and forth between them, trying to figure out what had left them in such a flabbergasted state. Madara recovered first, though it was still a slow effort. He blinked once, twice, then slid his eyes down to their connected hands. Knowing the man as well as he did now, Tobirama wasn't surprised in the least when his fingers were not dropped like a hot iron. Instead, the crushing grip softened to a gentle hold, unwilling to let go because they may be enemies, but there were few people left alive who were willing to even so much as touch this man. Any human connection was a blessing. Guys. Hashirama wriggled impatiently. Come on, this is getting creepy. You just staring at each other. What's going on? He looked ready to start shaking them until Azuna's eyes fairly rolled back in his head with exaggerated surprise. Oh my god, are you soulmates? He cried despondently. No. No way. Aniki, you can't be soulmates with a gross and you. Hush, Azuna, they are supposed to be our allies. You can't just call them gross. But it's him. Azuna flapped his arms in Tobirama's direction, and that was enough to break him out of his stupor. He glared back at his rival, torn between snapping back at him and reluctantly agreeing with the sentiment. Actually sympathizing with Madara, of all people, wasn't something he'd had on his agenda when he woke up this morning. They were going to have to deal with it at some point, though. And he supposed that Madara wasn't exactly hard to look at if one could ignore the fact that he was a loose cannon on the best of days. His hair was nice. The shape of his jaw was rather pleasant. Tobirama just barely managed to stop himself from mentally waxing poetic about the man's eyes, so deep, so pretty, so perfectly shaped, and turned away with a scowl, shoving Hashirama to the side to make room so he could storm off towards Han. Whatever, he called back over his shoulder. Make your pace. See if I care. You don't need me here to make fools of yourself, so if you will all excuse me, I'm going somewhere with less idiots crowded around. I hope he's gone off to drown himself, Azuna could be heard muttering behind him. Surprisingly, it was Madara's voice that answered with a snarled, shut up. Perhaps, and this may have been the shock talking, but perhaps there was a very small chance that the universe actually knew what it was doing when it paired them together. Tobirama hurried his steps a little more. He would feel a lot better once he'd had the time to process all the memories he'd just consumed and gotten a little more used to the fact that he thought he might actually grow to like Madara someday. Chapter 175, Tobirama Bazuna, the one where touching gives you feelings of euphoria. Their first meeting was in the strip of forest considered no man's land directly between their clans. It was late, and with only the new moon hanging above them it was dark, cold enough to leave one wondering if winter was truly over yet. Tobirama was tired and dirty, sticky with blood and sore with bruises, hurrying home at speeds much too fast for his current chakra levels. He should have been looking ahead to check for enemies, but his head was too muddled to bother with sensing, and thoughts of home drove him onward long past the point when it would have been smarter to just find shelter and rest until morning. Crashing headfirst into another body was only half as surprising as the rush of giddiness that rippled through him on contact. Every ache and pain from his long, stupid mission slipped away to leave him floating in a cloud of absolute bliss. Then they hit the earth below with matching grunts and rolled away from each other. A small cry escaped him when the pain rushed back in and that perfect euphoria disappeared in an instant. What the hell? He didn't recognize the voice, but when his eyes cracked open he did recognize the fan printed on the other boy's collar. "Uchiha," he grunted. Their eyes met, and he had just long enough to take in the expression of someone around his own age, startled and confused and a little bit frightened. Then the boy scrambled to his feet and took off into the trees. He was alone in moments, left alive but reeling in the shock of having found his soulmate somewhere completely unexpected. It wasn't long before they met again. Standing on opposite sides of the river with weapons in their hands and honor displayed in the stitching between their shoulder blades. Tobirama had sifted through 100 rumors and chased down every scrap of information he could about their oldest enemies. He murmured the only name that could possibly belong to the boy in front of him and tried not to shiver when Azuna growled his own name back at him. They clashed, of course. What else could they do? He wasn't sure if Azuna felt the same, but Tobirama was incredibly relieved when their family separated without bloodshed that day. If Hashirama was going to be mad at him, then at least he didn't have to deal with knowing he had hurt his own soulmate as well. After that it felt as though Azuna was around every corner. Each time they were called to battle he found the other boy there, and it only took a few clashes before they found themselves facing each other, blades raised to hide the shadow of reluctance in both of their eyes. Tobirama hated that he had become an echo of his brother, holding back his full strength against just one enemy as though it could ever make a difference, but he couldn't fathom the thought of cutting down his own soulmate. He wasn't sure what made Azuna hold back, but it wasn't as though he would ever have a moment to ask. Several years passed before finally it occurred to him that he could have that moment only if he made it himself. They were years filled with silent watching, careful memorization, endless nights spent remembering the tiniest micro-expressions that crossed Azuna's face and trying to dissect what they might mean without any true knowledge about the man. Of course he recognized how stupid it was to fall in love with someone who only ever raised a sword to him. He also understood that he was risking the worst sort of reaction from Hashirama when he first came up with a very stupid plan, a plan that definitely wasn't going to work, but he had to try anyway. It felt like every eye was on him the day Tobirama lowered his blade without warning in the middle of battle, lifting his body out of a ready stance to merely stand there with his arms loose at his sides. Azuna froze. The other man was visibly baffled, though he at least refrained from attacking while his opponent was vulnerable. Peace wouldn't really be that bad. Tobirama immediately wanted to smack himself in the face for being unable to come up with anything better than that as an opener, no better than anything Hashirama had been trying to tempt Madara with for the past few years. Azuna blinked at him. What? It wouldn't be the worst thing in the world, would it? Working together. Getting to know each other. He was positive that his face was about to burn off with embarrassment, but forced himself to take his chance anyway. We're not actually fighting about anything, really, just following the feuds of generations past. I'll put my blade down if you do the same. Pinching his lips together, Azuna very slowly let the tip of his sword fall. Tobirama's eyes flicked down to watch when the man popped one hip out, but when he looked back up it was to see Azuna rolling his eyes and looking slightly flustered. Don't look at me like that, Senju. Like what? Tobirama shifted, uncomfortable that he was being so obvious. We are enemies. You should not be trying to devour me with your eyes, Azuna mumbled. I was not. He was unsuccessfully fighting off the burning in his cheeks when both of their siblings arrived, Hashirama already halfway into a good crying jag and Madara puffed up with so much indignation his hair was standing on end. Others on the battlefield were stopping to watch as Tobirama was forced to dodge his brother's arms when they reached out to hug him, and Madara immediately stepped in front of his own sibling to make sure he was okay. Tobirama wondered if it was too late to run. "Stay away from him," Madara snarled, and it was so typical that Tobirama rolled his eyes without thinking, though it was Hashirama that replied for him. "But they are making peace," he crowed. "Isn't this wonderful?" "No. Your brother is not allowed to touch my brother." "I think I can speak for myself, Aniki," Izuna said, poking his head out to give Madara a dangerous look. He looked nothing so much as exhausted when Madara spun around to pat him on the shoulder. "Don't worry, I won't let him get anywhere near you." Before the two of them could set off bickering as all siblings do, Hashirama gave up on forcing Tobirama to hug him and turned to his estranged best friend. "Oh, come now, we should let them talk. My baby brother finally wants peace. Can you believe it?" "No," Madara deadpanned. "For what it's worth," Izuna said, "I think he's serious, at least. We are sort of soulmates." It took more than half an hour for everyone to calm down from that announcement. Hashirama did his best to hold Madara back from violence while weak in the knees himself with prideful tears. Tobirama tried not to look as awkward as he felt while Izuna explained that they had known for years, listening interestedly to the admission that his other half hadn't known how to deal with being matched to a mortal enemy and felt caught in limbo, unable to kill yet unable to pursue. Izuna spent most of that half hour looking exhausted by his own sibling. Eventually the screaming stopped and Hashirama felt safe to let Madara go, trusting that he wouldn't immediately attack the one he assumed had been violating his precious person. Tobirama met Izuna's gaze when it passed his way but mostly stayed quiet. There was no point in making the situation worse. He'd done his part and now all he could do was wait for Izuna to actually respond to his offer. He didn't have much longer to wait. Peace wouldn't be entirely terrible, I suppose. Izuna ignored his sibling's offended gasp. "Tell you what, if you can give me one really good reason to consider it, then I'll see what I can do to convince the elders." Tobirama nodded. That sounded fair. And he did indeed have one very good reason up his sleeve. All eyes truly were on him as both sides had entirely stopped fighting long enough to watch Tobirama step around Madara with lightning speed and sweep Izuna into his arms for a fierce kiss, tipping him back ever so slightly and being certain not to let him fall. Triumph washed through him, accompanied with that almost forgotten rush of utter euphoria when he felt Izuna kiss him back, but it didn't last long. Less than 30 seconds had passed when they were ripped violently apart by a very upset-looking Madara, rage in his eyes and steam all but pouring out of his ears. Hashirama, unfortunately, was swinging too hard to stop him this time. "Get off of him!" Madara shrieked, backing away from him on stumbling feet. In his arms Izuna swayed and pressed a hand against his lips. "All right. That was a very good reason." He smiled, and it was just slightly dopey, distracted almost. Tobirama puffed out his chest and grinned, absolutely shoving Hashirama off to avoid yet another hug. "I can do better," he boasted. Izuna perked up. "Oh? I think I'd like to see that. We should probably test to see if it only felt that good because of the bond." "Right, yes. Test it. For science." "For science, yeah. Clearly that's all I'm interested in." Izuna cleared his throat. "So, peace at 7? "Absolutely." Tobirama was so pleased he couldn't even bring himself to be annoyed when Madara hissed at him, dragging Izuna farther out of his line of sight. He turned away to allow Uchiha brothers a few moments to collect themselves and was immediately met with Hashirama's wobbly, watery eyes, hands clutched tightly just under his chin and bottom lip trembling with happiness. It was a disgustingly familiar sight, and yet for once he couldn't be bothered to feel his usual exasperation, much too high on his own successes. Both Madara and Hashirama jabbered on for 10 minutes trying to get either of them to tell them what peace at 7 was supposed to mean, but neither saw fit to say anything, so eventually Madara called for the Uchiha to retreat. Hashirama waved them goodbye like an old man waving his little grandchildren off after dinner, to which Madara sent back a very rude gesture. Tobirama ignored both of them as he looked up to mark the position of the sun above them. At 7 o'clock that evening he very much planned to be in a very specific part of the forest between their clients in that strait commonly known to be no man's land, where he hoped to find the one he'd been waited for all this time now finally waiting for him. He had promised Azuna he could do better, after all. Tobirama was more than prepared to be a man of his word. Chapter 176, Tobirama Kakashi, the one where your step counter reaches 0 when you meet. He didn't walk much. It was true that he went where he was needed and he exercised as much as necessary to keep in proper fighting form, but other than that, Tobirama didn't walk much. For the most part he stood in the bow of his ship and let the wind tug at his hair, wondering if he should get it cut and then wondering if he should let it grow, letting his mind fill with anything other than thoughts of the dwindling numbers on the inside of his left wrist. Spending his time at sea was lonely and exhilarating all at once, a prison made of nothing but freedom. With the sea beneath them and the wind pulling them wherever she would, it was something new every day, yet always the same old, same old. Tobirama could admit freely that he loved the juxtaposition of piracy. What he could not admit to any but himself was that he had gone to sea to avoid his numbers. After all, who was he going to meet out here on the ways with nothing but empty map for miles in any direction? It wasn't that he didn't truly wish to meet his soulmate. He might not look like the type, but Tobirama dreamed of love as much as the next man did. Rather, it was that he had watched what love had done to his brother, had seen the way Hashirama gave everything of himself and how it never seemed to be enough for the one he had been matched to, watched his brother wither and bend under the weight of trying to be more than he could be. That wasn't the life he wanted for himself. Perhaps it was only that life had been cruel to Madara and left him unable to connect to another in the wake of his own brother's lust, but watching them had left sour thoughts in the back of his mind as the years went by. Tobirama wasn't afraid of many things, but he found himself terrified to know what the universe had in store for him. Would he too be sent a broken soul, one down before they even had a chance to meet? His steps were low today, dangerously low, and each time his foot pressed down on the slick wood of the empty bow he cringed, knowing the counter on his wrist had just dropped yet another number to bring him ever closer to the dreaded 0. It would be today or tomorrow, he knew. With so few numbers he had only the choices of reaching his and or never walking again. And being the captain of his ship meant never walking again was a non-option. Voices shouting from the aft deck caught his attention and shoved away all thoughts of his impending 0. Tobirama turned and followed the repeated calls of his name, heels snapping on the wood until he came to a small knot of sailors holding something over the railing, so many of them gathered around that he couldn't see what it was they had brought aboard. Someone said adrift. "Captain," Sakura grunted, her thick shoulder rolling in a shrug. "He's so pale we thought he was part of the ways until we drew abreast of him." "Is he alive?" His first mate didn't bother to answer, only jerked her thumb over one shoulder when the sound of violent coughing broke through the rush of voices. Tobirama rolled his eyes and cleared his own throat. Immediately a path opened up for him to step through the crowd, each of his crew respectfully giving him room to take stock of the situation. It was only 2 steps forward and he didn't realize it until he had taken them, but they were the 2 most important steps of his life. Electricity buzzed up the length of his arm as soon as his boot touched the deck at the stranger's side, and Tobirama was left gaping down at the image of a fallen angel, pale skin and pale hair to match his own, but eyes that were dark like a starless night and one perfect beauty spot low on the right side of his chin. He knelt, reverent and apprehensive in equal measure, to lay a hand on the exhausted stranger's shoulder. "Are you all right?" he asked. "Not dead," came the answer. "I suppose that counts for something, though I'm going to throttle Guy if I ever catch up to the leaf again." Tobirama stepped back to allow the man space to regain his feet, watching pale knees wobble and stumble forward. His arms shot out to catch the man when it looked like his feet wouldn't be able to hold him, but he was surprised all over again to see the shocked expression looking up at him from the body in his arms. "Oh. I had 1 step left on my counter when I went into the water. And it just reached 0 and Kiyua." Tobirama swallowed against a sudden lump in his throat. "Here I am," he repeated, glad that their voices would be hidden other is by the wind. This was a private moment. "Maybe I'll kill Guy Jedley. I can't believe his stupid idea actually worked." The man coughed and fought to stand up on his own. My name is Kakashi. And I'm Tobirama, captain aboard the Will of the Wave." "You have the look of a seafaring man. How came you to be set adrift?" "Oh. My best friend threw me overboard." Kakashi chuckled awkwardly and scrubbed at his wet hair in the ensuing silence. Tobirama felt his face twitching but managed to refrain from any violent movements. He had seen his share of deeds in the time he'd spent at sea, and of course he'd heard of mutinies before, of betrayals most foul, but this was the first time he had encountered anything like that himself. That it was his own soulmate who had suffered such a fate had him enraged and cautious in equal parts. Flaring his nostrils, Tobirama forced himself to remain calm as he spoke. "Someone bring this man a blanket. Are you all blind? He's half drowned, let's at least get him warm." His gaze returned to Kakashi. "If I might ask why your so-called friend threw you overboard?" My counter only had one step left, but there wasn't anyone on board that I hadn't met yet. So he threw me overboard so I wouldn't have to stay in the same spot until we made port or something." The man shrugged like it made perfect sense to him, or perhaps it was just that his friend made a habit of strange acts like that and he had grown used to it. "You need a new friend," Tobirama rumbled. He was unreasonably delighted to hear Kakashi laugh. "Nah, he's not so bad. Guy means well." Although he was of the opinion that intentions mattered less than actions, Tobirama chose to keep his silence as Sakura reappeared with a blanket to throw over Kakashi's shoulders. Meeting his soulmate had always been a concept that terrified him in a way he couldn't properly explain, something he had actively tried to avoid, yet here was Kakashi standing before him dripping water on the deck and smiling despite being ostensibly betrayed by his own best friend. The universe really wanted them to meet, apparently. No matter what efforts he had gone to, he was going to have to face his fears now, whether he wanted to or not. The only choice left to him was whether he would go forward with grace and poise, or if he would flail like a child disappointed that things hadn't gone his way. Clearly maintaining his dignity was the obvious decision. "If you would come with me, I believe I should like to hear more of your story," he offered, hoping the expression he had rearranged his face into was at least somewhat inviting. It was strangely relieving to see Kakashi grin. Sounds good to me." They shared a nod, and then Tobirama stepped back to lead the way. He made it a mere 3 steps before someone from the gathered crowd piped up. "Hey look! Captain's numbers. They reached 0. Oddly enough, having his biggest few broadcast in such a way almost made everything feel easier. So he had found his soulmate. Everyone had one, everyone met theirs, and it was a perfectly normal part of life. Whether or not they would be any good for each other remained to be seen, but if Kakashi was at all interested in being together, then he would be understanding of Tobirama's caution about the whole situation. Now all he had to do was talk to the man, get to know him a little. Tobirama snorted softly. He'd never really been much good at that part, but he was, surprisingly, more willing to try than he'd thought he would be. It might possibly have had something to do with the devilish smile waiting for him every time he looked back at a very smart Kakashi. Chapter 177, Kasame Sakura, the one where you have a tattoo what reaches for your soulmate. Sakura had a decapitated head in one hand and a bloody kunai in the other when she paused to glare at the man who dared to go after one of her targets while her back was turned. "Excuse me," she growled, grinding her heel against another man's face. "This is my bounty, not yours. Aren't you supposed to be dead?" The one she was addressing merely shrugged without care for the fact that he had been declared killed in action by his own summoning jutsu almost 5 years ago. "I'm a little harder to get rid of than that," he said. Sakura scoffed. "Well, hold still and I'll see what I can do about that once I'm through with these amateurs." She wasn't that worried. Hoshige Kasame was a tough nut clearly if he had gone head-to-head with Gai-sensei, even if he had chosen to fake his own death rather than finish the fight, but she herself wasn't exactly a soft swinner. If he chose to run, she could track him down and deal with him in turn. It was just luck that he didn't run. Or maybe it was the curiosity she could see shining openly in his eyes. Whatever it was, he was still there by the time Sakura flicked one finger against her last target's forehead, knocking him out cold with a single blow. This woman was the most expensive out of the group, and since Sakura had been paid already to take them out in whatever manner she saw fit, then she might as well earn the extra bounty for bringing her in alive. Kasame actually clapped a little when she turned to him, sharp teeth exposed in a feral grin of approval. "Very nice, girlie, very nice." His eyes dragged down her form with a deliberately slow movement, but it was hardly the first time someone had attempted to make her uncomfortable in such a way, and Sakura ignored it easily, no matter how much she enjoyed it when someone took the time to appreciate her hard-earned biceps. "From the way you're looking at me, I think we both know that you know who I am," she said. "So you know damn well my name is not Girly." Her new target lifted one careless shoulder. "I thought it suited you." They clashed without warning, without banter or bother. It was clear she intended to take him in, and it was just as clear that he had no intentions of simply allowing her to do so without a fight. When she was able to gain the upper hand in only a couple of minutes, Sakura might have suspected the man of going easy on her if not for the sweat dribbling down his right temple or the way his teeth were audibly grinding with frustration. It was probably his overinflated ego and the male folly of allowing his eyes to wander that let her win, but Sakura wasn't picky. She knew how to take her wins where she found them. Clapping a chakra seal on the back of his neck was incredibly satisfying still, leaving her cocky and triumphant when he fell gasping at her feet in the sudden absence of his massive chakra store. For someone like him, it would probably be almost painful to have so much locked away from him all at once. Sakura let him curse and mumble under his breath for perhaps 10 seconds before rolling him over with one foot. "Clothes off," she commanded. "Let's see how many weapons you've got hidden in that cloak." Kasame waggled his eyebrows suggestively but complied. The fact that she had picked up his sword and was holding it to his throat probably helped convince him to cooperate. Sakura wondered how upset he would be to learn that Killer Bee still carried Samahada, or if he had ever attempted to retrieve it. As she suspected, weapons rained from his clothing like water from a cloud. Kunai littered the earth at his feet, chakra wires spooled and bounced away, senbon tinkled against each other cheerfully, and Sakura kept a firm grip on the sad replacement sword he tried very hard to gut her with. When he pulled his shirt off to pluck out the weapons hidden in the seams, her gaze caught on the small tattoo low on the man's ribcage. Even as she watched, it inched farther towards his front, making her frown and wonder if he had a partner she didn't know about moving around her current position. Spreading her chakra as far as she could, she was no censor for all that she had excellent control over every last drop of chakra at her disposal. Eventually she came to the cautious conclusion that there was no one poised to attack her from behind and returned her attention to the man in front of her. The man with rippling abs and arms to die for. Why was it always the hot ones that went evil? "Hoshigate Kasame, you are now property of Konoha," she told him in a flippant tone. "Anything you say can and will be ignored. Let's see how fast my Sama responds to a letter, then we have you in custody." "Very fast, I would imagine. She's been waiting to get her mitts on me since I left that hellhole." He shrugged easily, suspiciously unconcerned with his own capture. At the ready for some kind of escape attempt, Sakura approached him with the intent of bringing him in to face the justice he had earned. She was not prepared for the tattoo on his ribs to scurrying up his pectoral muscles to balance on his shoulder the moment she reached out for him. Dropping her hand, Sakura frowned and lowered her hand again. The tattoo stayed where it was. Kasame watched her curiously as she slowly waved her fingers back and forth an inch above his shoulder, and he already looked ready to burst with questions when she gasped, leaping away to clutch both hands to her chest. "Is there a problem?" he drawled. Sakura faltered her way through several half-syllables before finally she was able to blurt out an answer. "It's following me," she said. "Following you?" "Yeah. Your mark, it's following me. I think it's waiting for me to touch you." Even as she spoke the words, it was hard to believe them, hard to convince her throat to breathe around them. Kasame eyed her dubiously. "That would make us soulmates," he pointed out. Sakura put her shock aside for a moment to roll her eyes at him. "Duh. Thanks for pointing out the obvious. Fine then, if we are not being polite about things." She gave him no more warning than that before plunging her hand forward to take a firm grip of his shoulder where the pattern of black ink seemed to wait for her like an overeager puppy. The effect was immediate. Electricity jolted up her arm to run through her entire body, much like she had been struck with a right arm. From the way Kasame jumped at the same time she did, Sakura could guess that he was experiencing the same thing and that he was just as unprepared for it. Seeing the way his mark reacted to a presence and knowing intellectually what it meant was one thing, but actually confirming the fact that she was soulmates with a world-renowned criminal was quite another. When the sensations faded, Sakura realized that she was still standing over her prisoner, clinging desperately to his shoulder with an iron grip. As much as she wanted to release him, she was ashamed to realize that she also very much did not want to. A large part of her that hadn't existed a moment ago recognized the connection between them and wanted nothing more than to extend contact for as long as possible. She forced herself to let go anyway, leaving the two of them staring awkwardly at each other for several minutes. A not-so-discreet glaze told her that her own mark had traveled all the way down her arm to rest in her palm, reaching for more contact the moment she released him, and the pattern had changed so that the edges of her own mark would line up perfectly with his. It was a little worrisome how difficult it was not to reach out and do just that again. Damn, Kasame broke the silence eventually. I got a pretty sweet deal out of this. As soon as she finished lecturing him on exactly why this situation was in no way a sweet deal for him, Sakura would definitely take him back to Konoha and turn him over to the authorities as planned. She certainly would not be using the journey to size him up and rethink her stance of the issue of conjugal visits. That, of course, would be irresponsible, and Sakura was nothing if not responsible to every Judy. Chapter 178, Madara Tobarama, the one where you have a spirit guide. Tobarama's animal guide was a cat, a lazy good-for-nothing smug little shit that lounged on the furniture and watched him with eyes that always seemed to mock him for something he could never figure out. It was pretty to look at, he wouldn't deny that, all white and gold and almost translucent. Beauty did not make up for the annoyance of that mocking stare, though. Hashirama laughed and told him he deserved it. Tobarama left spiders under his pillow again. Resisting the urge to follow his spirit animal wasn't a problem for him like it was for others, since his stupid cat never actually tried to go anywhere. No matter how many times Tuka explained that it probably meant his other half was supposed to find him, Tobarama remained certain that his cat was just lazy. How could he, of all people, be meant to sit and wait? That wasn't his style at all. If he had a question, he had always been the sort of person to ask questions or go find the answer himself. Waiting was boring. It was boredom that chased him out of the house and into the forest when he was 10 years old, irritation that made him flop down on the bank of the Naka River to scowl at his dumb spirit guide. The cat only yawned and licked its chops without care. Only when a massive glowing snow leopard burst from the trees did his guide finally move, leaping to its feet just in time for the two beasts to crash together in a glittering explosion of light fragments. For a few moments, during which he stood in shocked silence, Tobarama could only think that of course he finally got to see the damn thing move quickly, only to have it disappear for good. Then his brain finally caught up with him and he realized why, precisely, the thing must have disappeared. Tobarama hated that stupid cat even more when he found out that his soulmate was an Uchiha, a loudmouthed brat barely older than himself and only half as mature. It was hate at first sight, and he felt absolutely no remorse for dunking the idiot into fast-moving currents before dashing off towards home. He could hardly believe his own bad luck to have matched with such a crappy soulmate. Not that it stopped him from quietly checking the riverbank every chance he had thereafter. It took a week before Hashirama suddenly looked around the room with the expression of one who'd had a revelation. "How come I haven't seen any of your stuff knocked off the walls in a while? Is your guide okay?" he asked. Tobarama eyed the spot where the damn glowing cat, visible only to himself, had spent most of its time lounging. "Gone," he grunted. "What? But then so you've met your soulmate. Who is it?" Tobarama scowled and dapped his chin down to concentrate on the blades he was supposed to be cleaning. "Doesn't matter. Can't be together anyway." Matching with an enemy wasn't exactly unheard of, and his brother may have been an idiot, but he wasn't stupid. Hashirama was quick to connect the dots, face drooping into a sympathetic pout. Tobarama ignored him. He didn't need a soulmate to be happy. In fact, he didn't need anything that he didn't already have. He would be perfectly happy spending his life in support of his elder brother. And yet, when the moon rose high and Hashirama had fallen asleep across the foot of his bed, Tobarama snuck out of his room and ran to the river, his heart hoping for something that his head told him would never be possible. He spent the night alone. He was 15 when they met again, dangling his toes in the water and trying to decide how he felt about the news his father had given them. Most shinobi died in battle. Not many lived long enough to gather their children and coldly explain the sickness raging through the body. Cancer, he had called it. Tobarama wasn't sure what to think about the whole thing. Was he supposed to mourn the impending loss of a man he'd never truly loved? The sound of a snapping limb caught his attention just in time for him to hear an indignant yelp and witness his errant soulmate plunge out an overhanging tree into the river. When Madara resurfaced, Tobirama was howling with laughter, clutching his stomach as he rolled on the ground. "It isn't funny. Aren't you supposed to be a censor? You suck. I got so close to you because you suck." On and on he railed, but all Tobirama did was continue to laugh. The fool looked like nothing so much as a damsel in distress, with all that hair plastered to him and a lily pad clinging just behind one ear. It was an unexpected brightness in a day he expected to be filled with nothing more than morose introspection. "Aren't you a censor too? You know I have to be infusing chakra to feel anything." Tobirama tilted his head to admire the disaster in front of him from a better angle. Madara screeched but didn't deny it, and that small triumph would have been enough on its own to lift his mood. Riding the waves of that uplifting wind, Tobirama spent the next hour dodging verbal bards and lounging much like his cat used to, comfortable where he was sprawled out across the rocks, yet unwilling to question why he was so relaxed in the presence of someone he should have been trying to kill. He also chose not to wonder why Madara was not attacking in turn. If Hashirama was allowed to go through life with his head in the clouds, then Tobirama should be allowed one day of letting things slide. When they parted that day, he swore to himself that something like this could not happen again. He'd had his fill of whatever it was his stupid heart was looking for, but it had to stop now. Half a week later, he found himself fishing a broken tree branch out of the Naka River while Madara sulked that the evidence of his own stupidity hadn't vanished on the current. Once more he told himself that it could not happen again, and once more he knew he was lying. But Suma was dying. It was a cold fact, terrifying for all that he did not love the man. His father's death meant change. It meant Hashirama taking over the clan before he was truly ready, before they were certain that the Council of Elders was ready to support him without thinking they could somehow control him. The politics of the situation promised to be a nightmare in the coming year. And yet Tobirama had found a silver lining no one else in his quietly panicking clan was privy to. In the summer sunshine, Madara's smile was a sweet thing, hard-earned and beautiful in the quicksilver moments when they weren't bickering over something. He did enjoy their frequent battles of wit, but there was a different feeling to knowing that Madara was smiling for him, happy to be there with him, amused at something he had said. Long since given up on denying himself, Tobirama wondered if everyone else fell in love with their soulmates this quickly. Barely more than a year had passed since they began meeting regularly, and already it felt as though he had known Madara for a lifetime. Surrender and selfishness, he had discovered, tasted like freedom. Dangerous and addictive. Time with Madara was stolen from things he should have been doing, like training or helping Hashirama read through the clan records in search of some useless nugget of information to back up some unimportant argument. He did do the important things still, of course. Madara couldn't be his whole life. Yet for all the hours he spent acting the perfect Senju-san, at least half of them were abuzz with thoughts of how long Madara's hair was getting and how much he wanted to braid it through with flowers just to mock him for looking like a girl. Softness between them was always offset with something else, afraid of facing the truth hidden in their words. Although it was possible that reason was only on his part. Tobirama watched Madara from the corner of his eye, listening to him ramble on about something annoying Azuna had done and the sweet revenge of dunking him in the koi pond. He wasn't sure. He wanted to know if Madara felt the same longing that he did. They could never truly be together, after all. What would be the point? Autumn had covered the riverbank with a dewy blanket of colorful leaves the evening they first kissed. Tobirama choked on the lecture he'd been giving his soulmate on why it was stupid not to wear armor in battle, fingers tightening on the bandages they were tying around a blooded arm. They broke apart when the action caused Madara to flinch. "Woi. Careful of the goods," he admonished. Tobirama blinked at him. "You kissed me. And you tried to take my arm off for it. See if I do it again." Tobirama flailed internally and maybe a little bit externally as well. "What? I never asked you to kiss me." "Good. I'm not gonna anymore." Madara scrunched up his nose in a jeer, and Tobirama felt his blood boiling, though it was hard to tell if he was angry or excited or some other strange emotion in between. Well, take this." Jerking forward before the other had a chance to dodge him, Tobirama crushed their mouths together again and poured everything he had into a kiss that rather quickly turned much steamier than he had intended. All he'd been trying to do was make a point. What kind of point he had no idea, as it was lost from his mind immediately when Madara's teeth nipped at his lower lip. 16 years old, feeling like he had stolen a bit of happiness just for his own, Tobirama held tight to the sleeve of Madara's robes and promised himself that the world would have to make him let go. "You not said at all?" Madara asked for the 8th time. The very concept of not loving one's own father seemed to baffle him, for all that he wasn't exactly close to his iron. Tobirama shrugged. "No, we knew this day was coming. He was sick and now he's dead. Hashirama will take his place and I will support him. There's nothing to be said about, really." Uninterested in the conversation, Tobirama rather pointedly leaned over against his companion's shoulder. Perhaps if he smiled the way Madara liked, he might earn himself another kiss. But no, instead his statement was met with a heavily exasperated sigh and a hand pushing him away. Tobirama narrowed his eyes. Separation simply wouldn't do, not when he had spent the better part of an hour figuring out a distraction to keep Hashirama occupied so he could slip out to this meeting. After all that effort, he deserved all the attention and contact he wanted. Or at least that was his opinion, and since he wasn't often given to caring for other people's opinion, his was the one that mattered the most. Ignoring the protesting squawks from beside him, Tobirama dodged underneath the shoving arms and fell sideways until his upper body was cradled in Madara's lap. He allowed himself a smug chuckle when he was not immediately flung across the clearing. Very few people could claim this level of familiarity with the boy underneath him, and even fewer could get away with this unharmed. Other than himself, there was probably only one other person who wouldn't be risking death, and that was only because Azuna was the last surviving sibling. "Talk about something that isn't boring," he demanded. "I'm sick to death of talking about Batsuma." "All right, how about we talk about your brother?" Madara huffed down at him. Why haven't you told him about us?" "I understood when it was your father in charge, but Hashirama would understand. You know damn well the first official thing he's going to do is pitch the idea of a peace treaty." Running fingers absently through Tobirama's hair, Madara glared down at him, his expression in direct contrast with the gentleness of his touch. Tobirama chewed on his lower lip. "But what's the point of having one side behind us and not the other? You could never leave your clan, and I would never ask you to. So if there's no chance that your father will see reason..." "I see your point." Slowly sitting up again, Tobirama carefully balanced himself on one knee to throw the other one over his partner's lap. When he had settled himself, he leaned forward to wrap both arms around Madara's neck and bury his face against the smooth skin there. 17 wasn't very old in civilian terms, but in shinobi years he was already approaching his prime. In this world they both understood that there were no guarantees that either of them would live to see tomorrow, and yet what scared him the most was not the idea of dying, it was the idea of waiting out the rest of his life without Madara by his side. When Madara began petting his hair again, he hummed and burrowed deeper in protest of whatever the other was about to say. "So it's going to be tough. And I can't believe I'm about to say this, but my father won't live forever either, you know." Those words froze him in place, but a hand cupping the back of his head kept him still as Madara went on. "If there's no other options left, then we play the long game. Some way, somehow, it might take years, but we'll get to be together. Properly, I mean. When I'm clan head, we'll make peace and we'll build that village, and then you and I. We are gonna take the world by storm." Tobirama slowly opened his eyes, looking out at the world around them through the curtain of Madara's wild hair, listening to the blood thunder in his ears. "Sounds nice," he admitted quietly. "You'll wait with me, right?" "Forever," Tobirama whispered. "For as long as it takes." Madara held him tighter and said nothing. They had already said everything they needed to. What they had was forbidden. It had gone from unwanted to the most precious part of their lives, and it was the biggest secret they had never told. It was something neither of them asked for, but it was theirs, and it was time they admitted they were willing to fight for it. Some battles were fought with blood and steel. Others were fought with time and patience. Tobirama smiled to himself as he felt the tension draining out of his shoulders. If that was all it took, then he was ready. He could be very patient. Chapter 179, Kiba Shikamaru, the one where the most important words are on your own. They'd known each other for years, and Kiba had been in love with that stupid spiky asshole for somewhat close to 3 of them when the words finally came out. As much as he'd known with his entire heart that he could never love anyone again the way he loved Shikamaru, Kiba hadn't actually suspected that they could be soulmates. It seemed just a little too far-fetched, a little too good to be true, so the idea had never even crossed his mind. Even worse, the moment they came wasn't anything close to significant. Both of them were drunk and alone on a Friday night. Others had been here earlier, of course, but their friends had all trooped off on some sort of unsteady adventure when Naruto piped up that he had a terrible craving for ramen. Apparently finding out whether or not Ichiraku's was still open at this hour was a 7-person job. Kiba lolled his head back, trying to tilt far enough that he could see past the back of the couch and into the kitchen. 5 minutes seemed like a long time for Shikamaru to be getting them another round of drinks. Maybe he'd gotten lost in the fridge. This was Chota's house. The fridge itself was the size of Kiba's entire pantry at home. "Did you fall in?" he called. Something clattered on the floor, something else rustled quietly, and then his friend reappeared in the corner of his vision with a triumphant smile and 2 beers. Almost, Shikamaru admitted. What does he even need that much food for? Despite concentrating very hard on not doing so, Kiba still managed to slur every single word in that sentence. Shikamaru didn't comment on it, luckily, only shrugged and handed him his drink. "He's an Akamicha. You know they are always ready to feed an army at a moment's notice." Since that was true and logical and very wise, Kiba granted him a sullen nod. Then he yelped and fell sideways when Shikamaru flopped down next to him, toppling his upper body directly into his companion's lap. The two of them stared at each other for a moment while Kiba's nose twitched, delighted to find itself in the epicenter of his favorite human scent. Then Shikamaru let out a single huff of laughter. "You fell over," he pointed out. "What a genius." Akamaru lifted his massive head from where he had been lounging on the opposite side of the kotatsu, whiffing gently in questions. When his human didn't answer, he lurched to his feet and padded around to drop his massive head in Kiba's lap. "No, not now," Kiba said, meaning to push him away but ending up petting his snout instead. "I think both of us together would be a bit heavy. And I don't think Shika wants he drilling all over him." "Sorry, boy." He felt bad immediately when Akamaru whined and his ears went all droopy. "Let him rest his head," Shikamaru told him. Kiba tilted his chin up so he could look at the young man he was lounging on, blinking to clear his hazy vision, and tried to rearrange his face into a brave expression. "You don't have to say that." Shikamaru rolled his eyes. "Wasn't just saying it. You're a package deal. You and your dog are always welcome with me." He jerked when Kiba gave a full-body shudder and watched curiously as he fumbled with the sleeve of his ever-present leather jacket. Since he was a very young child, Kiba had been careful and tear to leave his house without wearing sleeves to cover his words. When the material slid up, they both stared at the softly glowing writing on his arm, written in a hand that looked all too familiar to both of them. "That's my writing," Shikamaru said. His head was spinning. "You just said what this says." Kiba looked up at him with wide eyes and a slack jaw. "You said this." "My words. The important ones. You said me and my dog were important and were. No one's ever said that before." "I mean, the two of you are kind of a package deal," his friend pointed out. "Gotta love one to love the other." "Yeah. See, you get it." "Of course I do, I'm a genius." Shikamaru lifted both eyebrows and kept a straight face just long enough for Kiba to crack, and then both of them dissolved into helpless laughter that tasted like beer and bright futures. When they both calmed down, Kiba squirmed until he was able to sit up, setting his drink aside, then turned sideways and leaning back into Shikamaru's space to say, "I can't believe I've been in love with my own soulmate all this time. How crazy is that? Dan. I feel stupid now for not saying anything. I can't believe you're in love with me." Shikamaru breathed. For a moment Kiba wondered if he should be embarrassed to have accidentally blurted out his own secret like that, but there was too much alcohol in his system at the moment, and he was still flying high from discovering the identity of his soulmate, and that Shikamaru, of all people, was the one to understand the true heart of who he was as a person, to do anything except express his feelings the only way that felt appropriate. Embarrassingly, he missed on his first attempt at going in for a kiss. Kiba huffed when he heard Shikamaru laughing at him, shuffled a little to center his balance, and leaned in again. He definitely did not miss that time. They were, however, interrupted rather quickly by a sudden howling from the floor by their feet. Can you not see that we are busy? Kiba spluttered. Akamaru whined and scratched at the floor, shaking his head until his ears began to comically flop about. He's just upset that he's not a part of things. Did you need a kiss too, Akamaru? Shikamaru grinned when the dog whined again and dropped his head down to cover it with one paw. Kiba stared at his companion in awe. Man, you really do get us, chuckled. Then he lunged forward to chase those genius lips again, flipping Akamaru the bird while he did as a precaution against any more unnecessary interruptions. Chapter 180, Marutobi plus Hashiizo, the one where everyone is a shapeshifter. Izuna slipped one leg off the tree branch he was perched upon and let it dangle beneath him to counterbalance the weight he was leaning forward, abdominals twisting side to side as he tried to find a better angle to stare through the leaves. Are they even still fighting? He asked. They're not making very much noise, and that sort of worries me. From the branch just above him, Hashirama sighed, that special long-suffering sigh that could only come from years of sibling hurt. Tobi's changed forms. Madara's trying to stare him down, but you know how stubborn he is. You mean how stubborn they both are, Izuna corrected him. With one more twist he finally found a break in the leaves to peer through, spying on the two idiots across the field. Their brothers had been arguing for the better part of the afternoon, and it was hard to keep up with exactly what they were butting heads over since the topic seemed to fluctuate by the minute. Izuna was at least somewhat sure they had started today's bickering fit when Madara tried to find fault with Tobirama's kata stance, which was, of course, as flawless as it had ever been. From there they had gone through faulty paperwork, clan deficiencies, general hygiene, and mental capabilities. They were in top form, actually. Hashirama had remarked over an hour ago that he wished they could put half as much effort into their lacking personal lives as they did into these pointless bicker fests, and Izuna was still snickering about it. It was a fairly common opinion that they fought so much because they enjoyed it. So, with a sly grin that many would assume him incapable of, Hashirama leaned forward and placed a hand on Izuna's shoulder. Shall we take bets on who gives in first this time? Aren't you supposed to be laying off the gambling habit? Didn't Mido say something to you last week about that? Hashirama drooped. I regret letting her marry my cousin. They've been terrible influences on each other, and all they do lately is gang up on me. Grumbling inaudibly, he slid off his branch and came down to squat right in Izuna's line of view, peering out through the same spot he had been, while at the same time giving Izuna a delicious view of his backside. Now I can't see, Izuna grumbled for the sake of keeping up appearances. The words were half-hearted at best. You're not missing much. Madara's shaking one of his fingers at Tobi, but oh no, now he's waving them both around because Tobi yawned in his face. That has so much more attitude when he's a cat. I think it's the big tongue. Do you think all snow leopards have such big tongues? How should I know? Nonplussed, Hashirama turned back to shrug at him. Should we go separate them then? I suppose so. Otherwise they'll be out here all night, and Madara promised he'd take a turn cooking dinner for once. The two of them swung down from the tree in sync, and Izuna tried not to be obvious about how distracting it was watching the ease of grace with which Hashirama moved. For such a clumsy man, he sure was beautiful in motion, especially on the battlefield. There wasn't much need to search for a distraction, though, since the moment they started across the field was the moment Madara finally lost his temper and sank down to the level of childish demands. Change back, he shouted, clearly not expecting any sort of actual response. All four of them were startled beyond belief when Tobirama's form contracted and suddenly he was human again, half crouched in the spot he'd just been lounging and staring up at Madara with a gaping jaw. Madara stared back. You changed back. I didn't mean to, Tobirama breathed. Knowing what those words implied, Madara swayed on the spot. But you and I'm, so we. Yeah. Something like that. Madara nodded slowly, eyes so wide they were ready to fall out of his head despite the medical chakra that had secured them in place a year ago. If he lost those eyes after Izuna went to all the trouble of convincing him to swap, then he was in for a temper tantrum the likes of which Konohamakia had not yet seen. Eventually Madara seemed to gather himself enough to remember their surroundings and the two spectators watching from the tree line. By the scowl on his face, he clearly did not appreciate having such a precious moment witnessed by others. Tobirama still looked pretty dazed when Madara grabbed him by the arm and began to pull him away to somewhere a little more private, allowing himself to be led around and tripping over his own feet while he tried to force his brain to process what was happening. When they reached the far side of the field they stopped, murmuring to each other, regrettably too quiet to be overheard. Somewhere in that conversation they must have forgotten the entire point of moving away. Or perhaps one of them decided that he was too impatient to wait for a more private venue to present itself. Whatever the case, Madara was grinning like a fool when he went in for a kiss without warning, turning and bolting away with a smug expression as he changed forms to leap up into the trees. "You can't just do that without warning me." Tobirama shouted at his back before slipping into his own secondary form, snow leopard chasing after lion with his teeth bared playfully. Distant yells and the sounds of snapping branches drifted from that direction for several minutes after they left until finally the forest fell suspiciously quiet. Tobirama, apparently, had made a successful catch. Izuna blinked in the spot where they had both disappeared, murmuring under his breath, "Well, I wasn't expecting that." Before Hashirama could spew any nonsense about always knowing their brothers were meant to be, he could see it in the man's eyes, but surely not even someone like him could have predicted that two people who were at each other's throats so much were destined for each other. Izuna cleared his throat and cast about for something to distract them both. As nosy as he usually was with his brother's disastrous love life, he very much did not want to know how that conversation with Tobirama was going to end. Some things he just didn't want to hear about. Wild, huh? You know, I'm kind of surprised that neither of them tried that before. As he spoke, Izuna gently turned Hashirama around and set the man on a path back through the strip of forest that provided a natural barrier between training's ground and village. "You know, now that you mention it, me too." Hashirama hummed and watched the sky as he walked, only half aware as he was steered away from waltzing straight into a thick maple. They both really like to yell. And Toby does like to get out of arguments by just changing his form and going to sleep. It's very surprising that it took this long for Madara to use those words. He's an idiot, what can I say? Izuna snickered to himself and then dodged the fondly exasperated swipe of Hashirama's hand. In silence they wandered, following the path already worn through the loam by hundreds of shinobi, taking the same route through the forest to get in their daily exercise. After a few minutes Izuna let his thoughts drift, and he had already distracted himself watching a nest of newborn robins cheeping for their dinner when Hashirama began to chuckle to himself. "Did you see Toby's face?" he giggled. "That dumb look of shock." Izuna tried to imitate it without cracking a smile. Gasp. "How can it be you?" Making Hashirama laugh felt a little like triumph. "Yes." And then Madara's face. He should be more careful of his words. Hashirama looked over and pulled his face down into his best approximation of Madara's grumpy scowl, pitching his voice higher to try and match the other man's irritated shriek. "Change." Izuna didn't have time to laugh. Before he could do more than blink, something in his gut pulled until he thought his very soul might come flying out of his mouth. When the feeling passed, he shook his head violently and looked up at Hashirama, suddenly so much taller. Embarrassingly, it took a few moments for it to sink in what had just happened, but when it did he was hopping around in small circles, unable to contain the massive wave of emotions in just the small body of a fan-tailed raven. Izuna. Did you mean to change?" Falling still, Izuna shook his hard little beak from side to side. After a moment he realized that he was very free to change back to his other form despite Hashirama's demand having forced him into this one, so he did that, flowing back into human shape with barely a thought. Then he stood with both arms hanging loosely at his sides without a clue what to say. Luckily Hashirama had never been the sort of person who ran out of words. "Are we soulmates too?" he asked in a breathy voice. "I guess we are." It was hard to believe despite the evidence of the change he had gone through involuntarily. "Oh. Wow. Izuna, this is amazing." Without any further warning, Hashirama threw himself forward, catching Izuna around the middle to lift him up in the air for a tight bear hug and jabbering about how happy he was with the unexpected match. Getting swung back and forth through the air like a rag doll made him feel a little like a child, but Izuna couldn't bring himself to be all that upset about it. Not only had his secret crush turned out to be his soulmate, not only did Hashirama actually seem excited that it was him, but it looked as though Madara would be a bit too distracted over the next few days to interfere with the first few steps they took to figuring out their relationships. Life really was being kind to him lately. Chapter 181, Sakura Killer Bee, the one where you share a trait with your soulmate. When she was younger, Sakura wasn't good at much. Not for lack of trying or a lack of ability, per se, but more because she hadn't yet looked into the areas she was meant to excel in. As a child with a teacher too wrapped up in his own lingering tremors to pay them much attention, she didn't see much growth. It wasn't until she marched her way into the fifth Hokage's office and demanded to be heard for the first time in her life that someone finally took a good look at her and saw that her formless shape had the potential to be molded into something at least vaguely resembling greatness. Tsunade taught her the first skill that she mastered, a skill that was all her own, something that she could say she earned for herself. Healing wasn't something that came easily despite the fact that she seemed to have a great knack for it. It was something that came with hard work and determination, and every time she refused to let herself give up on it, she was rewarded with another incredible achievement. Learning how to punch mountains made her feel powerful, but learning how to stitch a bone back together and knowing that the small child she'd healed would get to run and play for years to come, that made her feel as though she was the mountain. A year into her apprenticeship, long after Naruto and Sasuke and Kakashi had all left her behind to hold up the frayed and crumbling remains of Team 7, Sakura wandered into the new weapons shop that had just opened down the road from her house. Her intention had only been to replenish her dwindling supply of shuriken. She never meant to stop and stare at the twin blades hanging in a display case on the wall behind the counter. The shopkeeper almost laughed when she asked to hold them, stopping only when he realized she was serious. He smirked a little still, indulgent in the way adults like to be with children when they think they know better, but he did pull them down and hand them over. Sakura's fingers seemed to know the handles as soon as they slid into her grasp. Until that moment it had never occurred to her that she might seek out some sort of weapon specialization. As a brawler, her fists were the only weapons she really needed, but there was something about the weight of those sabers that moved her to reach for the purse hiding in her kunai pouch. It was an impulse buy, something that felt right in a way she couldn't ignore. She never regretted it for a moment. Right from the very first lesson she bullied Genma into giving her it was though she had been born to wield them. Sakura was rather embarrassed that it took her a few months to realize that this must be the skill she had gained from her soulmate, wherever they were. Considering the way Kakashi-sensei had to wear a mask at all times to muffle his trait, and Ino's trait was nothing more than a knack for color schemes, Sakura was grateful to have been gifted with such a useful skill herself. Or maybe it wasn't the usefulness she appreciated, but the beauty of it, the artistry in the arc of silver blades cutting the air, spinning in her palms like deadly poetry. After spending so long earning her own abilities, Sakura still preferred to rely on her fists in battle, but she found a different relaxing sort of joy in winding down her day with swordplay, usually by seeking out Genma or Yuga for a spar. When Tsunade asked her to join a diplomatic mission sending aid to the Land of Lightning, Sakura thought very little of it, was eager, in fact, for the chance to put into practice all she had learned as a healer. The poison unit in Kumo-Dakia was woefully lacking, and she took great delight in the praise they heaped upon her for her offhanded suggestions for improvement. It was always nice to be recognized for something one has worked hard on. Her subtle hints that she hadn't even passed on a tenth of her own knowledge, and she a mere teenager with so much under her belt already, was just the icing on top, a warning in the friendliest of language, yet also an invitation. Kumo-Dakia took that invitation and offered their friendship by revealing the Jinkriki hiding in their midst. They couldn't have known, of course, what they were truly offering when they did so, but that didn't lessen Sakura's wonder in any way when she noticed the 7 swords he carried on his back. "You any good with those?" she asked, trying a little too hard to stay casual. "Of course I'm fool. Why a fool? I am an artist and these are my tools." His voice was startlingly loud, though it seemed to be the norm for him judging by the tired faces of the 3 following behind him. "Sensei," the red-headed girl whined. "You don't have to rhyme everything you say." Killer Bee turned to grin at his student. "I've got to take every chance I can to work on my lyrics, yeah." His hands curled themselves into signs that didn't seem to be meant for any sort of gesture, though Sakura couldn't fathom what other purpose they might serve. She dismissed that easily once she realized he wasn't attacking. Instead, she watched his silly hop-skipping dance and saw that the strangeness of it hid an offbeat sort of grace that appealed to her in a weird sort of way. Before his students could go on a rant about how often was really appropriate to say the same words over and over, a fight she herself had long since given up having with Naruto, Sakura stepped in and laid her hand on the massive Jinchuriki's arm, smiling up at him when he blinked curiously over the top of his sunglasses. "Hi. I'm Sakura, and I'm good with swords too." "Away, huh?" Killer Bee gave a booming laugh and made a few more weird shapes with his hands. "It's really cool that you've the groove. You should show me your moves." "What's your trait?" she asked, ignoring the way his students gaped at her for being so bold. "I'll heal my friends until the very end, YAC. It's not just me. I heal fast because I'm a Jinchuriki." "Ooh, that's good, that's good." Distracted by his own lyrical genius, he whipped out a small notebook and began scribbling away, muttering to himself as he tried to remember what he just said. Sakura bit her lip, not wanting to interrupt but too impatient over the possibility of discovery. Finally her curiosity won out and she grabbed his sleeve as she blurted, "I'm a healer. I'm a healer, and I was really good with swords even before I started training with them. I think maybe you're supposed to be my soul bond. If that's all right with you." For a brief handful of seconds she was 12 years old again, small and weak and forever forgotten by those she vowed she would follow after. Then Killer Bee's face broke out into the biggest smile she'd seen yet, and it was like sunshine washing over her. After meeting Guy-sensei, she didn't think she would ever be happy to see another thumbs up, but there was something honest and warm in the way her soulmate did so now with both hands, notebook of lyrics fluttering to the ground in a way that said she was so much more important than something he had obviously been carrying around for a while now. All right, that's cooler than night. Bonded forever, we'll be together, I'll be the brawn and you be the clever, yeah. Fool. Why a fool?" With that he reached out and clapped Sakura on both shoulders with an open expression, no more said on the subject, as though there should be nothing more to say than that. His easy acceptance was difficult to wrap her head around, but Sakura found herself echoing his smile without thought. "Sounds good to me," she murmured. I think we are going to be great friends."